The sun was already low over the Big Horn when Everett Cane walked barefoot down the stone path to his private spring and stopped. There was a woman asleep in his water. He had men 40 feet up the path. One word and it was finished. Every person on that ranch knew exactly how this ended. They had seen it end the same way 100 times before. He didn't say the word. What he did instead would be talked about in that valley for years. Not because it was violent, not because it was loud, because a man who had buried his brother, lost the use of his right hand, and held 400 families in the pages of a single ledger, stood 4 paces from a stranger and put his coat across her shoulders while she slept. Nobody could explain it. Nobody knew yet what she was about to cost him. The sun was already low when Everett Cane started down the path to the hot spring, barefoot on warm stone. His boots left behind on the porch, steps the way another man might leave behind his name deliberately, without ceremony, without looking back. The leather coat hung over one arm. Nothing above the waist, but the weight of the afternoon and the particular exhaustion of a man who had been carrying something invisible for so long that he had stopped noticing it was there. The path behind the main house of Hollow Pine Ranch cut through a stand of lodgepole pines and dropped down toward the flat shelf of rock where the spring surfaced from the ground in a steady, mineral-rich exhale. Steam rose off the water year-round, even in summer, even in the September heat that still held the high Wyoming grasslands in a grip that wouldn't fully release until October. He had made this walk every afternoon for 14 months. Same time, same 20 minutes. Same instruction to Amos Pruitt and whoever was posted above: no radio, no riders, no interruption from anyone, for any reason that did not involve fire or blood. It was the only appointment he kept without exception. He had missed meetings with attorneys. He had sent back letters from the territorial governor, unopened. He had once let a cattle buyer wait in the main parlor for 3 hours, because the clock on the wall said 4 and 4 meant the path. And the path meant those 20 minutes were his. Nobody who drew wages at Hollow Pine misunderstood this. Nobody tried. He was 4 steps from the bottom of the path when he stopped. There was a woman asleep in his water. Young. Her hair mostly pinned but not fully, the way someone pins their hair when they are in a hurry or when they have been too tired to care about the result. Her head was tipped back against the gray granite edge of the spring. Her neck relaxed in the deep way that only came from sleep that had overtaken a person rather than sleep they had chosen. She was wearing a calico work dress, dark brown with a faded blue print, the kind every woman in Renelier wore for a 12-hour shift. The fabric had darkened with water to the shoulder. Her boots sat folded on the near edge of the rock, the left heel worn down further than the right, the laces retied with a knot that had been redone. So many times the leather was creased in 4 places. And along her bare left arm, in the amber light that came low and flat off the mountain behind the ranch, he could see the bruises. Not from a fall. He had investigated enough trouble in 8 years as a federal deputy to know the difference between a bruise from a stirrup and a bruise from fingers. These were from fingers. Someone's hand closed around her forearm and held. Amos Pruitt came around the corner of the equipment shed 40 seconds later and pulled up short so fast his boot heel scraped rock. His hand went to his hip immediately. The right response. The only response a man in his position had ever needed on this property. And every single time it had ended the same way, quietly, within 5 minutes, with someone being escorted back through the main gate by 2 exceedingly polite men who did not explain themselves. Everett raised one finger from his knee, didn't lift his head, didn't raise his voice, because in 43 years he had never once needed to raise his voice to make himself understood by anyone standing within 30 feet of him. Amos went absolutely still. She's sleeping, that was all. He said it, the way another man might identify a cloud formation, without opinion, without instruction, without any indication that what he had just said was not the most natural sentence in the world. Amos took his hand off his hip. His mouth stayed open around the shape of the question he had been building, but nothing came out of it. He looked at the woman in the water. He looked at his employer sitting on a flat rock 4 paces away, forearms on his knees, barefoot, the leather coat no longer on his arm. He looked at where the coat had gone, and then he went very carefully and precisely still, and he stood beneath the pines with his arms at his sides, and he did not move. The first ranch hand came by 7 minutes later, cutting across the upper path with a load of split wood for the cookhouse. He slowed. He looked at the spring. He looked at the woman. He looked at Amos and got nothing back. He kept walking, but his pace was different on the other side of the path, and within 15 minutes, Hollow Pine Ranch had quietly arrived at a consensus that something unusual was happening behind the main house, and nobody was going to be the one to ask about it. Hetty Brand was standing inside the window of the kitchen. She was 71 years old, and she had come to work in this house when Everett's father was still the one who sat at the head of the dining table, and Everett was still a boy who had to ask permission to enter the study. She had buried 2 Cane men, the grandfather in a February blizzard, and the father in a warm spring that had fooled everyone into thinking the danger had passed. She had been present when Samuel Cane was carried home the first time from Cheyenne, alive, and the second time, not. She had seen the man currently sitting on that rock remain silent through an entire November evening without speaking to a single soul, and she had understood that was grief, and she had left him to it, and she had been right to. Now she looked at him sitting 4 paces from a stranger asleep in his spring, and she was the only person at Hollow Pine Ranch who understood exactly what she was looking at. Not because she was smarter than Amos or more experienced than the hands, because she had known Everett Cane since he was 9 years old, and she had watched him live for 43 years, and in all of that time she had only seen him go completely still, like that in the presence of something he did not want to disturb. She did not go outside. She went to the linen chest in the back hallway and took out 2 clean cotton towels and one of the spare dresses, kept in the smallest trunk, a plain gray muslin with a high collar and covered buttons down the front, kept for female guests, which Hollow Pine had not had in some time. She folded both towels over the dress and carried them out to the wooden chair set beside the gate that opened onto the path, left them within easy reach of the spring, and went back inside without once looking at the woman in the water. Amos watched her do all of it. He said nothing, because he was beginning to suspect that the old woman knew something he didn't, and because in 14 months of working directly under Everett Cane, he had learned that in this house, when you suspected that, you were almost always correct. At 4:05, Everett rose from the rock. He walked to where Amos stood. Amos straightened. When she wakes up, don't let her be frightened. Then Everett stopped walking. He turned his head toward the water, not toward Amos, and his voice didn't change at all when he added the second part. And find out for me who put those marks on her. He went back up the path without looking back. She woke because she was cold. The water had dropped in temperature around her shoulders, and the stone beneath her head had gone from warm to cool. And in the brief, suspended moment before memory returned, Mara Sutton simply thought she had fallen asleep in the wrong chair again, at the end of a long shift, and that she would have to explain it to someone, and that she was very tired of explaining things to people. Then she opened her eyes, and the ceiling was sky, gray-blue and enormous, and there was steam coming off water she was sitting in. She sat up so fast the world pitched sideways. She grabbed the granite edge with both hands and held on until the spinning stopped. Her hair was half down. Her boots were off. There was a man's coat across her shoulders, dark leather, heavy and warm, smelling of pine resin and horse and something mineral she couldn't name. She had no idea how it had gotten there. There were 2 men. One closer, no, not quite close. He was standing back, giving her room, arms loose at his sides in the deliberate way of someone who wanted to make sure his hands were visible. The other farther back beneath the trees, watching. The closer one was not what she expected, and she wasn't entirely sure what she had expected, but it wasn't this. Because the man standing at the edge of the spring was the largest human being she had ever seen in her life. Not exaggerated large, not the kind of large that men sometimes appeared when you were startled and your perception went unreliable. Genuinely, architecturally large. He stood at the edge of that rock shelf and filled the late afternoon the way a pine fills a hillside by simply existing at a size that everything else had to arrange itself around. His shoulders were wide enough that she thought, absurdly, that 2 of her could stand behind them. His hands were hanging at his sides, and they were the hands of a man who had done serious physical work for most of his life. Scarred across the knuckles, calloused at the base of each finger. He was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, canvas work pants, no boots. His face was the kind of face that had been weathered into its final form and had no intention of changing further. He was not looking at her the way men usually looked at a woman caught in a situation like this. There was no amusement in it, no calculation. He was simply watching her get her bearings, and he appeared to have all the time in the world for it. "I'm sorry," the words came out before she had organized them. "I'm really sorry. I didn't know this was private. I swear I didn't know." She could feel her voice picking up speed and couldn't slow it down. "My name is Mara Sutton. I work the evening shift at the Silver Spur in Renelier. My friend May won 2 nights at this resort in the harvest raffle, and she couldn't use them because her mother took ill, so she gave me the voucher. I have the pass right here." She held up her wrist, where the resort's cloth pass was tied, and immediately understood how inadequate that gesture was and lowered her hand. "I came through the east corridor. There was a gate open at the end of it, and some tarpaulins and a toolbox. I thought it was a maintenance passage. I followed it because there were no signs saying to stop, and I turned left instead of right and I..." She stopped. She started again. "I'll pay whatever I owe for this. I don't know the amount, but I'll pay it. I'll sign a paper right now if someone has one." He let her finish. He didn't interrupt, didn't nod, didn't make any of those small, accommodating movements that people made when they were waiting for their turn. He simply stood still until she ran out of words, and the silence that came afterward stretched long enough that she had to physically press her teeth together to keep from filling it. "You slept for 2 hours and 40 minutes in a thermal spring." His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that expected the first time to be the only time. "Do you know how dangerous that is?" She blinked. She was about to ask how he knew the precise duration when she understood. The pass. The resort's front desk had stamped the hour she collected it. Someone had gone to look up that number while she was unconscious. The thought hit her colder than the water. Core body temperature. Dehydration. A sudden drop in blood pressure when you stand. "I know. I was a medical student. I left in my 2nd year." He tilted his head. It was the smallest possible movement. "Why did you leave?" "My mother fell." She delivered it clean and even, the way she had learned to say it, because that was the only method that kept the rest of it, the nights with the alarm clock, the shifts, the letters from lawyers, the number on the paper, in the tin box from coming out behind it all at once. She saw him register it, the way the answer ended before it was finished. He didn't ask anything more. She gripped the edge of the stone and stood, pulling the coat closed over her chest. Her legs were uncertain beneath her, the way legs were after too long in hot water, and she braced until she felt the rock solid under her bare feet. She looked at him properly for the first time since she'd stopped panicking, and she saw it. His left hand was holding his right wrist, not crossed arms, not a pocket. His left hand was holding his right wrist, the way someone held something they had held 1,000 times before, in exactly the position that particular grip had settled into through repetition. The fingers were at the pulse point, not by accident. She had spent 2 years learning to read a body before she had quit, and 3 years after that reading bodies in a different way, the way of someone who turned a sick woman in the dark every 2 hours and learned where tightness lived before the person wearing it knew it was there. The words came out of her mouth before she could stop them, the way they had been coming out for 5 years whenever she saw a body doing something it hadn't been told to do. "That tremor isn't coming from your hand." She heard herself and could not believe she was speaking. "It's coming from your shoulder. There's something in that shoulder that hasn't healed, and your entire arm has been compensating for it so long that it can't stop. The hand shakes because the arm has no strength left for anything else after spending all of it holding that shoulder still. You're not holding your wrist, you're holding your shoulder." The sound that came after was not silence exactly. It was the complete absence of anything that had been moving before: breeze, bird call, the distant shift of horses in the paddock. Everything went still at once, the way things went still when the pressure changed before a storm. The man standing farther back under the trees had straightened so fully. He looked like a different person. Somewhere across the yard, something metal knocked against something wooden, and then stopped. And Mara stood in the cooling water of a stranger's private spring, in that stranger's coat, and understood that she had just done something considerably worse than wander into the wrong place. "I'm sorry." Her voice had dropped to almost nothing. "I had no right to say that. I don't know who you are, and I shouldn't have said it. I saw it and it came out. Please forgive me." He didn't answer right away. He looked at her in a way that was different from before. Before, he had been watching her find her footing. Now he was simply looking at her, and there was nothing in that look she could name or deflect. It was flat and complete, and without any of the usual signals that told you what a person was about to do next. It was the most absolute attention anyone had ever given her in her life, and it made her feel seen in a way that was almost physically uncomfortable because she had no idea what he was seeing. 14 months. She didn't understand. 4 doctors have come to this ranch in the past 3 weeks. His voice was still even. Not cold. Not warm. Even the way a plumb line was even. 1 from Cheyenne. 2 from Denver. The 4th came a long way by train and stayed 1 night. They examined the arm. They wrote down names for what they observed. They all told me the same thing. He paused. Not one of them mentioned the shoulder. Mara stood in the water and thought she should say something. She had nothing. He turned. The man under the tree stepped forward, and Mara pulled back instinctively, but he only pointed toward the wooden chair at the gate, where 2 folded towels and a neat gray dress were waiting in a pile she had not noticed before. His voice, when he spoke, was strange with something she couldn't classify, not quite disbelief, but adjacent to it. "Mrs. Brand left those for you." He cleared his throat. "Don't be afraid." The old woman was waiting at the kitchen door. She had a gray calico dress over one arm and an expression that indicated she had reached an age where she no longer felt obligated to justify her actions to anyone. She stepped back from the door and pointed at a chair near the cook stove and said, "Sit," without particular emphasis, in the tone of someone who had never had cause to say it twice in her life. The kitchen was large and warm, and smelled of wood smoke and dried sage and something that had been simmering on the back of the iron stove, long enough to become its own category of smell. Hetty Brand set a tin mug of water on the table and pushed it across without being asked. "Drink all of it. You were in that spring for nearly 3 hours. You are more depleted than you feel right now." Mara drank. She finished the entire mug. Only then did she notice her hands were shaking. "What is your name?" Hetty's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who asked questions because they needed answers, not because they were making conversation. "Mara Sutton. Renelier." The old woman sat across from her, back straight, both hands resting on the table, and looked at her with the unhurried assessment of someone who had been reading people for 7 decades and no longer needed more than a few seconds for the essential part. "I'm going to tell you a few things, and I'm only going to say them once." Mara set the mug down. "Do you know whose house you're in?" "No, ma'am, I didn't ask. I was afraid to." "Cane. Everett Cane." The name landed on the table between them like something solid, like something with density and edge. Mara did not move. Outside, the sound of hooves on packed dirt moved along the side of the house and faded. She could hear her own pulse, because she knew that name. People in Renelier knew it. People in Laramie knew it. People along every creek valley in the Big Horn Basin knew it. The way they knew the name of the mountain range itself, not because they had sought out the information, but because it was simply part of the geography of the place they lived. It appeared at the bottom of papers. Always at the bottom, always on the right, in slightly smaller print than the text above it. On the paper the blacksmith had signed when his forge burned. On the paper the widow who ran the dry goods had signed after her husband's accident. And on the paper her father had signed 6 years ago, which was now sitting inside a tin cookie box on top of the wardrobe in her mother's room, folded into quarters with the current number written along the bottom line. The current number was $96,000. Young woman. Hetty's voice was level. "You've gone white." "I'm fine," Mara said. She said it the automatic way, the way she had been saying it for 3 years to everyone who asked, which kept anyone from asking again. Hetty looked at her for a moment and did not press. Instead she said, "I need you to understand something before you leave through that gate. The way you came in this afternoon is not a way a person can come in. There is a magnetic lock on that interior gate. There are 2 men assigned to that corridor. A resort guest with a general access pass, walking unimpeded into the private spring, and remaining there for nearly 3 hours has not happened in 9 years of my working under him. She placed one finger on the table, which means there is a breach somewhere. The tarpaulins, perhaps. Someone forgot to reset the lock after the work crew left. Or someone did not forget, I don't know which. What I do know is what happens next, because in this house it always happens the same way. They find the breach, and while they find the breach, they find out who else knows it exists. You walked through it. Tonight, your name is on a very short list. Mara sat still. I just got lost. I believe you. That doesn't change the list. She reached for the mug that was already empty and set it down again. Do I owe this house money? Hetty asked. The question came so cleanly and directly that Mara had no wall ready for it. My mother does, she said. How much? She gave the number. Hetty's face did not move, and that absolute stillness told Mara that this woman had heard numbers like that many times before, and had learned that reacting to them served no practical purpose. Have you ever considered challenging the terms? There was a legal aid office in Laramie. Mara's voice was flat now, emptied out. The attorney there read the paper twice. When he finished, he said it wouldn't hold up if someone tried to collect by force. No court would enforce it. No lien on the property. Then he was quiet for a while, and he asked whether she was actually planning to take it to court, and she had understood what he meant. That's right, Hetty said. There is no courthouse for this. There are only men who know where you live. Mara stood and picked up the folded towels. Thank you, ma'am. I'll go and I won't come back. The old woman rose and walked her as far as the hallway and stopped at the threshold, and when she spoke her voice had changed. It was softer, not sentimental, something else, like a door that had been latched and was now standing just slightly open. Young woman, that coat, this afternoon. She paused. Do you know I stood at that window for a very long time? Mara turned back. Is something wrong? Hetty looked at her for a moment that lasted several beats longer than ordinary courtesy required. Then she shook her head. Nothing, she said. Get home safely. And she closed the kitchen door. Mara had nearly reached the main gate where her horse was tied when Amos Pruitt appeared beside the hitching post. He wasn't blocking her. He was simply standing 3 paces to the side, with his hat in his hands and a look on his face like a man who had been handed a task he was not entirely sure how to perform. He said that Mr. Cane would like to speak with her for 10 minutes, and that she was entirely free to refuse. Mara looked at the way he said that last part, at the careful neutrality of it, the kind a man produced when he was saying something he had been instructed to say, but did not personally believe was accurate. She looked down at the lead rope in her hands. She thought about the tin box on top of the wardrobe. She thought about her mother sitting at the kitchen table right now, in the lamplight, with the newspaper she never actually read open in front of her, waiting for the sound of hooves in the yard. She followed him. The back porch of the main house faced directly into the pines, and by that point the last light had gone completely, and the shapes of the trees were only slightly darker than the sky behind them. Everett Cane was sitting in a wooden chair at the edge of the porch. Fully dressed now, the flannel shirt had been replaced with a heavier work shirt of dark wool, collar buttoned to the second from the top, cuffs down and fastened. No coat. The chair sat at the edge of the porch boards, where the lamplight from inside reached but only barely. He did not invite her to sit. He began without preamble. Sutton. Renelier. Your mother's name is Cora. She's 58. Heart condition, onset 4 years ago following a fall. Your father was Thomas Sutton, deceased 17 months ago. The property is in your mother's name. The Wyoming Lending Trust holds an instrument against it currently reflecting a balance of $96,000 and some dollars, though the original advance was considerably less. He looked directly at her. I knew all of that before you had finished changing clothes. Mara stood on the porch boards and said nothing. She had thought about what she might face during the walk from the hitching post to the house. She had considered threats. She had considered legal language. She had considered condescension. She had not prepared for this, for someone to simply say it all at once, without architecture, without any of the protective indirection that people usually built around information they intended to use. You want me to be afraid? She said. No. If I wanted you afraid, I'd have sent someone else. He said it without any particular inflection. He said it like it was simply true. I'm telling you because I'm about to offer you something. And I don't want you accepting it and then discovering 3 days from now what I already knew about you when you did. Sit down. She sat. He described the Council of 5 Houses, the arrangement that governed the major landowning families across the territory, meeting once every several years to confirm authority, settle disputes, record transfers. He described the ceremony that had been part of it since his grandfather's time. The head of each house poured wine for the gathering with his own right hand and signed the family record in the same motion. A ceremonial confirmation of steadiness and legitimacy, he said. That sounds meaningless until you understood what it meant to stand in a room full of people who had come specifically to watch whether your hand could perform it. He placed his right hand flat on the low table beside the chair and held it there. After 4 seconds, the fingers began their small, involuntary movement. He didn't remove the hand. He let her see it. If that happens in that room, everything I hold passes into other hands within the week. He took the hand back. Make it stop in 30 days, he said, and the Sutton name comes out of the ledger. Not reduced, not restructured, gone, as though it never existed. Mara heard $96,000 in her head like a struck bell that had not yet stopped ringing. She thought of her mother at the kitchen table at midnight, still awake, still listening. She thought of the way Cora flinched every single time a horse came up the drive. She heard herself say, "I'm not a doctor. I didn't finish my 2nd year. I know. Then why are you asking me?" Because in 14 months, he said, you are the only person who looked at me and told me what was actually broken. The others looked and told me what I was paying them to say. Mara sat on the back porch of a man whose name made people in 3 counties go quiet, and she understood that she was going to say yes. She had known it from the moment he let her see his hand. She hated that she already knew. But when she opened her mouth, the sentence that came out was not the one she had been about to say. I have a condition of my own. Name it. You have to learn the names. Not my mother's name, you already said it. Like you were reading a line in an inventory. Too easy. I mean all of them, every name in that ledger. You're carrying paper on over 400 families in this valley, and you have never called a single one of them by their name. If you want my hands on you for 30 days, and every night you read 30 names from that ledger out loud until you know them. She heard her own words fall into the quiet and thought she had gone much too far. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her the way he had looked at her at the spring, completely, without layers, without the usual deflections. Then something happened at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile. It was the shadow of the muscle that a smile would have used. All right. He reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and removed a folded paper. He held it out. Start with your mother. She took it. It was heavier than a single sheet of paper had any right to feel. The ride back to Renoulier took 40 minutes, and Mara did not urge her horse beyond a steady walk. The paper sat in her vest pocket. The coat was gone. She had left it on the porch chair without thinking about it, which she only realized now, and which she filed away as something to examine later. The lamp was still burning in the kitchen window when she turned through the yard gate. Her mother would be at the table with the newspaper she wasn't reading, because she never read it, because she was listening for the specific sound of Mara's mare on the gravel. Mara came in through the back door and sat down across from Cora Sutton and told her everything. She left nothing out. Not the hours she had slept in someone else's spring, not the coat across her shoulders when she woke, not the bruises she hadn't admitted to anyone until tonight, not the way the name had landed when Hetty said it, not the back porch and the hand on the table and the 30 days. She told her, in order from the moment the gate was standing open in the stone corridor to the moment she pulled the folded paper from her vest pocket and placed it on the kitchen table. Cora Sutton pulled her reading spectacles down from where they had been resting on top of her head and read the document through once. Then she went back to the beginning and read it through again. Her lips moved slightly over certain phrases, the way they did with anything that carried a signature at the bottom. 30 days, she said. If his arm doesn't improve, everything stays exactly as it is. Nothing gets worse. Cora didn't answer that directly. She folded the paper along its existing creases, the sharp quarters of something that had been handled many times before by other people. And then she rose and went to the wardrobe and took down the tin box and opened it and set the new paper on top of the old paper and replaced the lid and put the box back exactly where it had been. She sat back down. Do you know how much it was in the beginning? The original amount? I never asked. $8,200. Her voice was steady with the practice of someone who has said a number so many times it had stopped being a number and become just a word. 6 years ago. I was in the hospital for 11 days after the fall, and the insurance your father carried through his work covered only part of it. When I came home, there was a bill on the table we could not pay. Your father didn't tell me what he intended to do. He went out 2 evenings, came home, and the bill was gone. He said he had borrowed the money from someone he knew through the stockyards. She touched the edge of the table. He paid it every month, never missed a payment. Not once. Sometime in the spring before he died, I found the payment book in the desk drawer, and I could see he had nearly finished it. Then he died, Mara said. Then he died, Cora said. And the number began to grow again. Mara sat in the lamplight and didn't speak for a long moment. She had heard pieces of this story before. In the same way you heard pieces of a thing you were not supposed to know, through the gaps between the things that were said out loud and the things that were simply present in the room. Do you trust him? Cora asked. I don't know, but I trust the way he talked. He didn't promise anything beyond what he said. He told me straight out that he'd had me investigated before I'd even finished dressing. People who intend to mislead you don't start by telling you they know exactly where you live and what you owe. Cora was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Sarah, and caught herself Mara. I'm going to tell you something, and I am not saying it to discourage you. She laid both hands flat on the table. In 6 years I've seen what you're describing twice. One December, one of their men came to this door. He saw me on crutches, and he was very kind about the payment that month. He said to leave it until after the new year. I slept well for an entire week because of that sentence. In January he came back, and the balance had grown by $2,000 in late fees. She looked directly at her daughter. Kindness from the person holding your debt paper is not a character. It is weather, beautiful until the following morning. Mara didn't argue. She let the words settle the way they were meant to settle, with their full weight, without rushing past them. And one part of her acknowledged that her mother was right, while another part of her was still sitting on a back porch in the dark, listening to a very large man tell the pine trees he was tired of being guarded, saying it to the trees and not to her, and she did not know yet where to put that sentence. Cora stood and carried the lamp to the windowsill and stood with her back to the room for a moment. Go to sleep, she said. If you only have 30 days, you have to start before dawn. Mara had reached the bottom of the stairs when a knock came at the front door. Not a pounding knock, a deliberate, unhurried knock. The kind produced by someone who was accustomed to arriving at houses late in the evening and did not find it unusual. She looked at her mother. Cora's expression had gone flat in the way it went flat whenever a knock came after dark. Mara opened the door. The man on the porch was perhaps 50, well built without being imposing, wearing a 3-piece wool suit that was too fine for the dust on the road from anywhere nearby. His hat was in his hand. His face was composed in an expression of pleasant, professional concern that looked like it had been practiced until it no longer required effort. He had the kind of stillness that came not from calm but from extreme self-governance. Behind him, tied to the gatepost, was a horse that had been ridden hard for some distance and had not fully caught its breath. Miss Sutton. His voice was unhurried and rich, the voice of a man accustomed to making himself heard in difficult rooms. I apologize for the hour. My name is Roland Vess. I've been a legal advisor and financial counsel to Mr. Cane for 11 years. She looked at the horse. He continued, I'm not calling to interfere with whatever arrangement he's proposed. Once he's made a decision of that kind, there is very little anyone can do to undo it. You'll understand that soon enough. He paused. But there are things about that ledger that I believe you should know before you place any part of your family situation in the balance of a promise made on a porch in the dark. He was already putting his hat back on. There's a roadside inn on the track to the Harmon pasture, about 3 miles north of town. I'll be there at 7 tomorrow morning. I hope you'll think it over before you decide. He stepped off the porch and onto the path without waiting for her to answer. The horse's hooves were already fading into the dark before she had finished registering that the conversation was over. Mara stood in the open doorway and felt the September night against her face, cool and dry, full of pine and distance. She felt the paper in her vest pocket. She thought about the way the man at the spring had sat 4 paces from a stranger for 40 minutes and not said a single word, and the way the old woman had set out towels and a clean dress without being asked, and the way Hetty's voice had changed at the kitchen door at the very end, going soft around a sentence that hadn't quite become a sentence. She thought about $96,000. She thought about her mother's face just now, going flat at a knock on the door after dark, the same way it had been going flat for 6 years. She closed the door. She did not tell her mother about the man on the porch, not that night, because Cora had just told her that kindness from the person holding your paper was weather, and Mara was not yet certain which direction this new wind was blowing, and she had learned young that you did not describe weather you hadn't yet stood in. She went upstairs. She lay down on her bed without removing her boots. She put one hand over the paper in her vest pocket and looked at the ceiling until the lamp burned low, thinking about the difference between a man who lets you walk away and a man who sends someone to find you before you can. She had spent 5 years learning to read the bodies of people who did not know they were being read. She had felt the truth of broken things in the muscle and bone of her mother's back in the dark, every 2 hours, year after year, until she could locate damage by the quality of resistance alone. She had left the medical college, but she had not left the knowledge. The knowledge was structural by now. It lived in her hands. And what her hands had told her when she saw that man standing at the edge of his own spring, holding himself together with his left hand clasped around his right wrist, was something the 4 doctors from Cheyenne and Denver had apparently not managed to say in 14 months, which meant either they had not seen it or they had seen it and not said it. And the distance between those 2 possibilities was the distance between incompetence and something considerably more deliberate. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about the name Cane and the paper in her pocket and the 71-year-old woman who had set out towels and a dress and then stood at the kitchen door with something she had almost said and then didn't. And she thought about the man on the porch just now with his well-made suit and his hard-ridden horse, and his 11 years of knowing Everett Cane, arriving at her door before she had even unsaddled her mare. A man who had already won, she thought, didn't ride hard through the dark to knock on doors. She closed her eyes. She would go to the inn in the morning, and she would hear what Roland Vess had to say. And then she would go to Hollow Pine Ranch and she would put her hands on a broken shoulder and begin to learn the truth of it from the inside, the only way she had ever known how to learn anything that mattered. The lamp went out. The kitchen was quiet below, and outside, somewhere in the pasture behind the house, the horses were moving in the slow, purposeful way they moved when they had decided it was time to stop waiting for morning and simply go on with the night. She left before first light. The mare knew the north track well enough to manage the first mile without much direction, and Mara let her, sitting the saddle with her hands loose on the reins and her mind working through the geometry of what she was about to do. Go hear a man talk. That was all she had decided. Hear him, and then decide whether what he said changed anything about what she had already decided the night before, lying on her bed, with her boots on and the lamp burning low. The roadside inn on the Harmon pasture track was a 2-room building that served coffee and biscuits in the morning to cattle hands moving between the valley ranches, and Roland Vess was already there when she arrived, seated at the far end of the plank table, with a leather satchel closed in front of him, and a cup of coffee he had not touched. He was the only person in the room who looked like he had slept. He stood when she came through the door, which was either manners or performance, and she had not yet decided which. He thanked her for coming. She said she wasn't sure she would. Neither was I, his voice carrying the particular pleasantness of a man who had learned to make even honesty sound agreeable. He sat when she sat. He did not open the satchel immediately. He put both hands on it and said, "I'll be direct, because I believe you prefer that and because I don't have time this morning for anything else. Do you know why he called for you?" She said he had already told her, because no one else had said what she said. Vess nodded slowly. Correct. But do you know why that hand matters so much to him? Not because it hurts. He opened the satchel. Inside was a sheaf of papers, each section numbered, the edges squared, with the precision of someone who had prepared it more than once. He turned it toward her across the plank table the way that Everett had turned his own paper toward her the night before, and the symmetry of it produced a brief, vertiginous sensation, as though she were being handed two ends of the same rope by two men standing in opposite directions. 14 months ago he was bedridden for 6 weeks, he said. A major household cannot stand still for 6 weeks. The other 4 families demanded an assurance, and I was the one who drafted it. He touched the first numbered section. The language is plain enough that I can render it in ordinary terms. His authority remains his as long as he can demonstrate he is capable of holding it, and the assurance specifies precisely how that demonstration is made. The ceremony, the wine and the signature. Mara said it before he could. So if he manages the ceremony, the assurance is satisfied. Correct. And the 4-line paper he gave you last night is worth precisely what he told you it was worth. Vess closed the page. But if he fails, the council assumes control, and that paper becomes a document inside a satchel no one opens again. He let that reach her. So that hand isn't his hand, Miss Sutton. It's your mother's roof. Mara did not touch the coffee the innkeeper had set down beside her. She looked at Vess across the table and thought about his horse, ridden hard through the dark, still breathing heavily when she had opened her mother's door. You want his hand to fail, she said. No. His voice was steady and patient. You've misread me, and most people do at this point. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the plank. When a man fails publicly, he becomes an injured man. People feel a complicated tenderness toward injured men. The whole situation becomes a wound that takes years to stop seeping. Money moves away from wounds. People keep their distance from them. They remember, and they let the remembering affect their decisions for a very long time. He looked up. I don't want him to fail. I want him to lose. Those are not the same event, not even close. And the distance between them is everything. The inn was filling slowly. 2 hands from the Harmon operation came in and took the other end of the table and called for coffee, and Vess waited for the noise to settle before continuing. I want him to walk into that room healthy and steady, pour 5 cups without a tremor, sign his name as cleanly as he did 20 years ago, and then lose everything that matters, completely and legally on the numbers. Not a tragedy. A result. A settled account. No one is unsteady for years over a settled account. He paused. People move on from results. They cannot move on from tragedy, and tragedy is expensive for everyone in the same market. Why are you telling me this? Mara's voice was level, but her hands had gone very still in her lap, under the table. You just told me the one thing that will make me work twice as hard. That's why I drove 3 hours before dawn, to sit across from you in this place. Vess looked at her, and for the first time the pleasantness fell from his face not into hostility, but into something more considered. Something closer to the actual man underneath the professional surface. Because I would rather be the person who told you the truth in the morning than the person you curse 3 weeks from now. He straightened the stack of papers without looking down. Fix him, Miss Sutton. Fix him as well as you can. I sincerely hope you succeed. It will not change who holds the paper on your mother's property. Mara stood. She pushed the untouched coffee to the center of the table. You're forgetting something, she said. Vess looked at her patiently. You told me all of that as though it were a door that was already locked. She put her hand on the back of the chair. But a man who has already won doesn't ride his horse half to death to knock on doors before sunrise. A man who has already won stays home and lets the clock run. She pushed the chair in, which means, somewhere inside that tidy stack of papers, there is something that worries you. And finding where something is wrong is what I do, Mr. Vess. It is about the only thing I have ever been genuinely good at. He did not answer right away. He let her get 3 steps toward the door. Then, in that same unhurried voice, not a fraction louder than it had been at the table, Miss Sutton. Would you like one question to take with you? She stopped at the door but did not turn. Ask him who set the number at 96,000. Not the original debt. The number as it stands today. Then watch his jaw. She rode straight from the inn to Hollow Pine without stopping. North on the Harmon track, and then east on the Upper Valley Road as the sun came fully above the ridge and turned the grass from silver to gold. She did not pause at the gate. Amos was already there, and he opened it without asking a single question, which told her that he had been told to expect her and that the instruction had not included a time. She told Everett she wanted to work outside at the spring rather than in the house. He came out 10 minutes later in his dark wool shirt, and when he asked why outside, she said, "Heat relaxes soft tissue. In a cold room you'll guard everything, and I'll only feel the guarding. I won't be able to reach what's underneath it." He sat on the granite edge when she told him to, his back to her. She stood behind him and said, "I'm going to put my hands on your shoulder now." She waited until he said, "Go ahead." Then she put her hands on him. She felt it immediately, and it was exactly what she had understood it to be from across a yard of open ground the previous afternoon. The scar itself was not the issue. The scar was a ridge of healed tissue, dense and fibrous, old news from the body's perspective, what the body was still saying loudly. In every fiber within 4 inches of it was something entirely different. The muscle running from the base of the neck down into the shoulder had been in a state of sustained contraction for so long that it had thinned and hardened to something more like a cable than a muscle. And directly underneath the shoulder blade, in the area that should have been doing most of the work of moving the arm, there was a particular quality of softness that was not health but absence. Tissue that had not fired properly in over a year. Muscle that had essentially given up participating, because the thing above it had long since taken over all decisions. She pressed her thumb carefully into the junction of the 2 zones. He did not make a sound. What he did was flinch, a movement so contained and so quickly absorbed that she would not have registered it at all, except that her thumb was in contact with the site, and she felt the response before she saw it. And then she felt the second thing, which was the controlled breath he took immediately after, the kind of breath a person drew when they had decided that what their body was doing was not going to show. Breathe out. Her voice was steady, clinical, stripped of anything that might give him reason to armor up further. "You're holding it in so I won't know. It isn't working. My hand is already there." He exhaled. Steam moved off the surface of the spring in slow spirals. "Tell me how it started," she said. "Not when. How?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might simply not answer. Then a dinner, a restaurant in Cheyenne. There were 7 of us at the table. My brother Samuel was on my left side. There was a back door through the kitchen that was supposed to be locked at 9 o'clock. That night it was not locked. He stopped there, precisely there, and Mara understood from the shape of the stopping that now this was the boundary established, not for her benefit but for his own. The line he had drawn, not because the story ended there, but because what came after it was still not something his lungs could carry all the way through without changing something in his face that he did not want changed. "I was holding a wine glass in my right hand," he said. "When it was over, the glass was still there. My brother was not." She kept her hands where they were and did not say any of the things that well-meaning people said in the presence of grief that had been folded and refolded until it fit in a shirt pocket. She had heard every one of those sentences from the neighbors and the church women and the men from the stockyards in the months after her father died, and she knew that each one, however genuine, required the grieving person to do a small amount of labor on behalf of the person who had said it. She had watched her mother perform that labor 14 times in a single afternoon once, smiling, nodding, saying thank you for the thought. She would not ask that of him. Instead, she moved her fingers 2 inches higher along the shoulder and pressed with a different part of her hand. "Here?" He said yes. She moved further and pressed again. He didn't say anything. The muscle beneath her palm answered for him, contracting before she had finished the movement, tightening in anticipation of pressure that hadn't arrived yet. "Do you see that?" Her voice was even. "It closes before I touch it. That means it isn't protecting against pain. It's protecting against the pain it has decided to expect." She stepped back half a pace and continued, her voice carrying the flat clarity of someone narrating a diagnostic rather than a conversation. "Your scar healed completely. I don't say that to be reassuring, I say it because it is structurally accurate and it matters to the treatment. But for 14 months, every muscle around it has been doing one job: holding that place still. It does that when you sleep, when you stand and talk, when you reach for something, and when you sign your name. And a muscle that has been holding without relief for 14 months doesn't have the capacity to do anything else. So when you reach out to lift something with actual weight, the arm has nothing left to give, and the hand shakes. She lowered her hands. Your tremor is not damage, she said. It is a habit that your body formed in response to something that frightened it, and it does not know yet that the threat is gone. He turned his head and looked at her. Go on, half your problem is in the shoulder. The other half is in the 14 months you have spent being afraid to trust it. And the second half is the one I cannot simply press out with my thumbs. She stepped close again, placed her palm flat over the same point as before, and applied slow, deliberate pressure. She watched the back of his neck. What she saw there told her what she needed to know. Here, she said. Is it pain or fear? He didn't answer. Across the yard, something shifted in the equipment, shed a settling sound. Nothing urgent. Answer me. It matters more than anything else I'm going to ask you. If it's pain, I treat it one way. If it's fear, I treat it the other way. And if I choose wrong, your 30 days pass and your hand looks exactly the same. He was quiet for long enough that she almost asked again. Then he said it quietly, in the direction of the water rather than toward her. I can't tell them apart anymore. And she understood from the texture of those words that he had not meant to say them out loud. That they had come out not because he had decided to say them, but because something in the structure of the moment had created a gap in his usual vigilance, and they had moved through the gap before he could close it. She stood very still for a moment. Then, that is the first thing I'm going to teach you. The difference between the two. She folded the treatment cloth and laid it on the stone edge. That's enough for today. He turned to look at her. 4 minutes and 3 questions. His voice was not sharp, but it was not entirely without challenge either. You want me to believe the arm is worth something at the end of this. I want you to still have an arm to work with tomorrow morning. You are holding that shoulder the way a man holds a door shut. If I force it open now, you won't lift a saddle in the morning. She set the cloth down and picked up her vest from the rock where she'd left it. 6 o'clock tomorrow. Eat something before, not after. I'll find my own way to the spring. She had gotten halfway up the stone path toward the gate when he called after her. Miss Sutton. She turned. Who did you speak with this morning? He asked it with neither inflection nor emphasis, in the same voice he had used to say everything else, which was somehow the most precise form of the question possible. She stood on the path and thought about the horse at her mother's gate, still catching its breath in the September dark. She thought about the word that Roland Vess had used, the nail, and she thought about the way he had said it, with the casual delivery of a man, placing a card on the table to see whether anyone else at the table had been watching. Tomorrow, she said, I'm going to ask you a question. Not today. All right. His voice was flat and final. Tomorrow. She went through the gate and did not look back, but she heard very faintly behind her the sound of him settling back onto the stone edge and the silence that came after it. And she thought that whatever Roland Vess's reasons were for driving 3 hours before dawn to sit in a plank table inn and tell her exactly how much her efforts would ultimately fail to matter, those reasons had less to do with her than everyone in this arrangement seemed to believe. The morning of the 4th day she arrived to find Roland Vess already in the yard. He had come around the corner of the tack building with his satchel under one arm, walking the way he walked everywhere, as though the ground he was crossing was already familiar to him, because he had already walked it many times before. Amos was standing under the gate arch and did not move to stop him, and Mara noticed the particular quality of Amos's not stopping, the small straightening of his posture, the slight realignment of where his eyes went, the posture of a man acknowledging authority he could not override. I apologize for the early hour. Vess set the satchel on the flat stone table at the edge of the yard. I have 3 things. I'll start with the most consequential. The Denver branch. I want to move the restructuring forward and announce it at the council meeting. No. Everett's voice came from behind Mara. He was already seated on the granite edge of the spring in the position she had established for the beginning of each session, and he had not looked up. And Mara felt, with the palm she still had resting across his upper back, the instant change in the tissue beneath her hand. Not a gradual shift, an immediate one. The word Denver and every muscle within reach of it went from guarded to locked in the time it took to say the word. I heard you, Vess said, but let me present the case. He opened the satchel. The other 4 families are going to arrive at that meeting with a single question in their minds. Whether you're capable of holding what you hold. If you walk in, complete the ceremony, and do nothing further. They leave with exactly the same question they arrived with. If you walk in and place a major piece of completed business on the table, the question disappears. I need 4 working sessions over the next 2 weeks. The first one tonight, I know the hour, but the Denver people aren't available before 9. Move it until after the council meeting. It cannot be moved. The entire weight of this announcement depends on placing it there, at that meeting. Afterward, it is only paperwork. Mara spoke before she had decided to speak. Let me say something. She heard her own voice carry across the yard and was briefly, absurdly surprised that it didn't waver. Both men looked at her. She was kneeling on the folded work cloth she had brought from the ranch house linen closet. She was still holding Everett's shoulder with both hands. She thought for 1 second about standing, about making herself taller before she spoke. She decided against it. There was a kind of authority in staying exactly where you were. No, Vess said, very pleasantly. Everett said nothing. He did not turn toward Vess, and he did not turn toward her. He simply remained where he was, and he did not pull his shoulder away from her hands. And she understood in that instant that he had just done something with that stillness had given her something without appearing to give her anything at all. She looked at Vess. You need him to lift a pitcher that weighs the better part of 5 pounds with his right hand in front of 60 people. That is what you are selling next month. Correct? That's correct, among other things. Then hear me clearly, because this is not my opinion. This is what I felt under my hands 30 seconds ago. She pressed the heel of her palm slowly into the tissue at the base of his neck, at the junction where the problem was loudest. This shoulder is in a defensive state. It has been in a defensive state for 14 months, and it has learned to read threat, the way a soldier reads a horizon constantly, automatically, without distinguishing between what is actually dangerous and what merely resembles danger. A hand pressing down on it, a sleepless night, a 2-hour meeting at 9 o'clock in the evening with people he has to remain composed in front of. To the muscle I'm working on right now, those 3 things are indistinguishable. They all produce the same response. She felt him hold his breath as she increased the pressure and released it. He did not make a sound. And what that response locks away is precisely the strength you need in his hand on the day you have arranged for people to watch him use it. She kept her other hand where it was and looked directly at Vess. 4 evening sessions in the next 2 weeks, she said, and I lose those 2 weeks entirely. Not half of them, all of them, because every morning after I will spend the first portion of the session undoing what the previous night put back into place. So choose, Mr. Vess, a steady man, or your schedule. You do not get both of those things this month. Nobody in the yard spoke. Amos, who had been studying the stitching on his left glove, had stopped doing that. Vess looked at her for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds the pleasantness of his expression disappeared not into anger, which she had expected to find underneath it, but into something of a different quality entirely. The look of a man who has walked past a familiar wall and heard an unexpected sound from inside it. Then the pleasantness returned as though it had never gone anywhere, as though it were a garment he had simply set down for a moment. Well, he told her. Genuinely. He closed the satchel. I'll defer the Denver announcement until after the council meeting. He picked it up and took 3 steps toward the gate, and then stopped without turning around. When he spoke again, his voice was still pleasant, and it was directed at Everett rather than at her, and he said it the way he said everything without apparent effort, without any particular emphasis, as though he were commenting on the weather or the state of the road. You keep saying my house, my hand, my family. You say it so naturally that you no longer notice when you say it. But I do. He took another step. One day someone is going to remind you precisely how much of any of that you actually own. Then the gate closed behind him. The sound of his horse faded down the north track. Mara released Everett's shoulder and sat back on her heels, and only then did she register how hard her heart had been working. He was still watching the gate. Did you know he was going to say that? No, but I knew he had been thinking it. She began wrapping the cloth, her hands doing the familiar work while her mind ran back over the exchange and tested each part of it for what it had actually meant. Vess had come here today for 3 reasons, and had announced 2 of them. Whatever the third was, it had not been spoken. It took Amos 5 days to find Deke Rourke. Mara learned this from Hetty, who told her one morning, while she was waiting for Everett to come out to the spring, and who delivered the information with the same tone she used to report that the salt stores were running low, or that the north pasture fence needed attention, informational, without editorial, but with the particular care of someone, ensuring that someone else was not walking into a room uninformed. Rourke had been in Ranelia the previous Tuesday at 10:30 in the evening. He had come into the Silver Spur and seated himself in the section Mara worked. He had waited until she brought the bill to the table. Then he had taken hold of her wrist and held it there, on the table's surface, in clear sight of the two nearest tables, while he reviewed the Sutton account's outstanding balance and reminded her of the consequence of missing the following month's payment. He had done this before. Hetty did not say how many times, but the word before carried the implication of more than twice. Mara said nothing. She had kept her sleeve down all that week. She had told her mother she had caught the edge of a tray. He was brought up to the ranch the following afternoon. Mara knew because Hetty told her, and she had meant to be gone before he arrived, and then she wasn't, and she stood inside the window of the parlor that looked across the yard into the room, with the open door, and did not look away. Deke Rourke was broad through the chest, and wore a canvas work coat and a hat with a flat brim, and when he walked through the door of Everett's study he was smiling, the particular smile of a man who believed he had been summoned because he had done something correctly. Everett was behind the desk with a stack of papers in front of him. He did not look up. He did not invite Rourke to sit. He kept reading. 1 minute passed. The smile held. 2 minutes. Rourke shifted his weight from one boot to the other. 3 minutes, he removed his hat and held it. 4 minutes, and the sound of paper turning in a silent room was as deliberate as anything Mara had ever heard, and she was standing 20 feet away on the other side of a wall. Rourke's face had changed color by then. Everett set the papers down. "Do you know her name?" Rourke blinked. "Sir, her name. The woman you put your hands on." Everett's voice had not changed register once since Rourke had walked through the door. It was the same unhurried, flat cadence it always was, which made what was inside the cadence harder to locate, and therefore more present. Rourke opened his mouth. He searched. Mara watched him search, and she watched the exact moment when he arrived at the understanding that there was nothing in his memory to search through, that she had existed for him only as a notation in a collection record property address. Outstanding balance, the name on the instrument's top line, which he had never once read carefully enough to separate from the account number beneath it. The Sutton account, Ranelia. That's the name on the paper. Everett's voice was level as a carpenter's line. "I asked for her name." Rourke said nothing. "Then you have your answer." Everett picked up the pen from the desk surface. "As of today, you are finished with this territory. You do not collect for this organization in Ranelia, in Laramie County, or anywhere else I operate. Amos will walk you out." He looked down at whatever he had been writing before. "If I hear that you have gone to any door in any of those places, I won't send for you again." Rourke stood for 2 more seconds. When he spoke, he did not say it as an argument. He said it the way a man said something he genuinely needed to understand. "I was doing exactly what I was told to do." "I know," Everett said, and he did not look up. "That's why all you're losing is the territory." No one touched Rourke. He walked out on his own. Amos followed 3 paces behind. A horse moved in the yard, and then the yard was quiet, and then the ranch was quiet, in the way that large places went quiet after something small but irrevocable had happened inside them. Mara stayed at the window until her hands were steady. Then she crossed the yard and went into the study. He knew she had watched. It wasn't a question when she said, "Hetty told you." "Yes," Mara said. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the man behind the desk and tried to determine what she was feeling. There was something hot and specific behind her breastbone that was not quite any single emotion she had a name for. "Were you going to tell me?" "No." "Why?" "Because you would have asked me why I did it, and I don't have a good answer." She heard her own breathing. She thought about her wrist on the table. She thought about the way she had kept her sleeve down all that week, which was not the first week she had kept her sleeve down. She thought about how tired she was of arranging her clothing and her hours and her expressions around what other people decided to do with their hands. "Did you do it because of me?" she asked. "Or because right now I'm the thing you're depending on to fix yours?" He looked up for the first time since she had entered the room. "Do you want the answer that's easier to receive?" he said. "Or the true one?" "The true one. I don't know." He said those 3 words and stopped completely. No explanation attached. No softening clause. No sentence designed to make them easier to carry. Just the 3 words, placed between them with the same lack of ornamentation with which he had said everything else. Mara stood in the study of a man whose decisions shaped the contour of entire families' lives across the Big Horn Basin, and she understood that, if he had said anything else, she would have found it insufficient. That this blunt, unresolved piece of truth was the first thing in longer than she could accurately calculate, that no one had smoothed into a shape designed to go down easier. She nodded once. 6 o'clock tomorrow. Eat before we start. She had reached the door when he said her name, Miss Sutton. She stopped but did not turn around. That man was doing exactly what he was instructed to do, he said. You understand that part. I didn't remove him because he committed an error. I removed him because today was the first time I looked at what that instructions looked like when someone was on the receiving end of it. Mara stood with one hand against the door frame. The wood was dry and warm from a full day of September sun coming through the south-facing window. Tomorrow, she said, I'm going to ask you the question I told you I'd ask, and I hope very much that you answer it the same way you just answered that one. She went out through the yard and through the gate, and found her horse and rode the south road home, and the sun was low enough behind her that her shadow stretched out ahead on the packed dirt, longer than she was, pointing home before she had finished deciding to go there. The question that Vess had left with her at the inn door sat in her mind the way something small and hard sat in the bottom of a boot, not necessarily painful yet, but present with every step. Who set the number at 96,000? Not the original debt, the number as it stands today. Then watch his jaw. She had promised herself she would ask it tomorrow, and she would. She would ask it with her hands on his shoulder, so she could feel the answer in his body if the words came out in some shape that was easier than the truth. She had learned the hard way that hands didn't lie the way voices sometimes did. Hands didn't know how to lie, they only knew how to hold on. The mare turned into the home yard without being told. The kitchen lamp was on. Cora was at the table. The newspaper was open. Mara unsaddled, watered the horse, came in through the back door, and sat down. She didn't speak for a few minutes. The iron stove ticked as the fire inside it settled. Her mother didn't ask where she'd been because they both knew where she'd been. She didn't ask what had happened, because the kind of thing that happened in the course of this was not the kind of thing you reported day by day. What she asked instead, after a long quiet, was this, Mara. She said it without looking up from the newspaper she wasn't reading. I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you working on that man's shoulder because of the paper? Or has it started to become about something else? The lamp burned. The stove ticked. Mara looked at her hands in her lap and tried to answer, honestly, and found that she could not, and found that the inability to answer was itself a kind of answer, and that it frightened her more than anything else about the 30 days. Including the $96,000, including Roland Vess and his horse, ridden hard through the dark, including the question she had promised to ask tomorrow, and the jaw she had been told to watch. I don't know, she said. Cora turned a page of the newspaper she wasn't reading. I know, her mother said. That's why I asked. The lamp put its light across the table between them, and they sat inside it together, 2 women in a kitchen in Wyoming, in the September of 1882, and outside the window, the first hard stars were coming up above the eastern ridge, cold and very far away, and neither of them said anything more for a long time. She asked the question on the 6th morning. The session had run its first 20 minutes in silence, which had become the established pattern: work first, words after, the body's information collected before the mind's interference could cloud it. She had her palms pressed flat against the upper plane of his back, thumbs bracketing the spine at the base of the neck, and she was applying a slow rolling pressure that moved incrementally toward the site, the way you approach something that startled easily, without announcement, without anything that resembled a rush. She had felt, over the last 2 mornings, a change she had not yet named out loud. The band of muscle along the right side of his neck, the one that had been holding with the consistency of a loaded timber beam since the first morning she touched it, had begun to give slightly under sustained pressure. Not much. A fraction of an inch, and only when she held the pressure long enough that the tissue stopped deciding to resist and simply forgot to. But a fraction of an inch was an event. In 14 months of 4 doctors and who knew how many different treatments, a fraction of an inch in that particular muscle was likely the first movement that direction had ever made. She didn't say it. She finished wiping her hands on the work cloth and sat down on the stone edge a short distance from him, and the spring put up its slow steam between them, and she said, "I'm asking the question now." He said, "Ask. Who set the number at 96,000? She kept her voice level. Not the original debt, the number as it stands right now. She had promised herself she would not look at his jaw. She looked, and it did precisely what Roland Vess had told her it would do. A tightening in the muscle below the ear, held for 1 full second, then released. Not anger, not guilt. Something older than either of those things, the involuntary response of a man who has just been asked to walk across ground he knows is unstable. Who told you to ask that? Vess. At the inn on the Harmon track, the morning after you gave me the paper. He nodded once, without any register of surprise. Sit back down, he said. This is longer than you think. She sat. The ledger, he began, is not mine alone. He said it without preamble, without building up to it. Do you understand what it means when a man uses property as security for a loan? Someone gives you what you need, and in exchange they hold that property as their assurance. He looked at the water. 14 months ago, when I was flat on my back and this entire operation was beginning to come apart at the joints, I needed capital to keep it standing. And the only thing I had with enough weight behind it was the ledger. 412 instruments, all of them, offered as a single security. Mara said nothing. Which means, he continued, I am not the person who owns your mother's debt outright. I am the person who holds the right to determine what happens to it. I can eliminate it. I can maintain it. I can do anything I choose with it, as long as I remain the one who holds that authority. And I hold it for as long as the assurance that Vess put together continues to recognize me as holding it. You've seen the document. I don't need to explain that part again. She had understood, abstractly, the night she had read the paper on the porch. She understood it differently now, with her hands having been on his body for 6 mornings, and her mind having turned the whole architecture of it over daily in the time between. The paper you gave me that night, she said, is valid, he said, to the exact degree that the authority behind it remains mine. No more than that. You knew that when you wrote it. I did. She stood up. Her legs did it without her deciding. You let me ride home and tell her, she said. Her voice did not rise. It stayed precisely at the level it had been, which was somehow harder to be in the room with than if it had risen. I sat at her kitchen table at close to midnight, and I told her I had the paper now. I watched her fold it and put it in the same box, where she keeps the one from 6 years ago. I let her believe that something had finally become certain. And she slept that night. She slept the whole night without waking at every sound from the road, and you knew exactly how narrow the ground beneath her feet actually was. And you still let me ride 40 minutes home carrying it. He did not answer immediately. He did not stand. He did not look away, and he also did not do the thing she had been bracing herself to endure, which was to apologize in the particular way that turned the other person's pain into an inconvenience the apologizing party was generously managing. Because it was the truest thing I had to stand on at that moment, he said. I didn't have anything wider to offer. If I had promised you more than that, I would have been making it up. And if I had told you exactly how narrow it was, I would have lost you there on the porch. He looked out across the spring. That's the second reason. I was afraid that if you saw how narrow it really was, you'd leave. And I would go back to being something kept under glass, with one man after another riding in from distant towns to tell me in careful language that I needed more time. When he finished, he stopped. He did not add anything to soften the landing. He simply let what he had said be what it was. Mara stood there with the work cloth still in her hands and discovered that she wanted him to have lied. She wanted him to give her something she could be cleanly angry at, something with clear edges she could push against and then ride home from. He didn't give her that. He gave her the true thing which had no clean edges, which was instead the exact irregular shape of a man who had made a calculation and was now standing in the result of it and not pretending he hadn't made it. "I'm still going to fix your shoulder," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't forgive you for what you did that night. Maybe I won't. Don't wait for it," he said. "All right." She had taken 3 steps when he called after her. "Miss Sutton." She stopped but didn't turn. "The nail Vest told you to look for," he said. "It's real. He didn't lie to you about a single thing." He paused. "But that nail isn't on his page, it's on mine." She went through the gate and rode home and did not look back, and the sentence followed her the entire way. On the 10th morning she put a tin cup on the granite edge of the spring, filled nearly to the brim, and said nothing. He looked at the cup, he looked at her. He extended his right arm, positioned the way she had been teaching him, shoulder dropped deliberately, weight settling into the zone below the shoulder blade rather than the cramped and exhausted zone above, and he lifted the cup to chest height. Water moved across the surface as his hand found its equilibrium. The cup held its level for 2 seconds. Then a thin line of water ran over the near rim and dropped to the stone. He set the cup down. She dried it with the cloth, filled it, said nothing. He lifted it again, water moved. More this time over the far rim, he set it down. They did this 11 times. 11 attempts, 11 spills, and by the 8th she could see his jaw working. Not because of pain but because of the indignity of it, the particular frustration of a man who had spent 43 years doing very large things with his body, and was now losing a negotiation with a cup of water. "Stop," she said before the 9th attempt. "I can do it," he said. "You can't yet. And that is not the problem you think it is." She took the cup off the edge and held it. "You're lifting from the shoulder. The whole shoulder is coming up to support the wrist, and that shoulder has been spent since before I got here, so it shakes, and when it shakes the water moves." She placed 2 fingers against the area under his shoulder blade on the right side, pressing into the softer territory she'd been working to wake up for a week. "Here, this is what needs to do the work, not the area above it. It has been disengaged for over a year, and now I'm requiring it to come back into service, and it is very unhappy about that." He looked at the fingers against his back, like waking someone up before they're ready. "Exactly like that," she said. "And people woken up before they're ready are uncooperative." He almost smiled. Not quite. On the 12th morning she changed the approach entirely. She took the cup away, had him lie face down on the folded blanket she had started bringing from the ranch house, and gave him a single exercise: press the right elbow into the stone. Steady pressure, not force. Hold it, release. 30 times. It looked like nothing from 3 feet away. It looked like a large man lying on a rock pressing his elbow into it for no discernible purpose. By the 20th repetition his shirt was soaked through. "This is the most useless thing I've paid money for in my life," he said into the blanket. "If you still have air to form full sentences, you're not working hard enough," she said. 10 more. He did the 10 more. In the evenings he read the names. This had become its own ritual, with its own rules and its own particular quality of quiet. They sat at the long table in the ranch house dining room with the ledger open between them. Hetty Brand walked past the doorway twice each evening and did not pretend she wasn't listening. He read 30 names in the order they appeared in the ledger: family name, location, sometimes an age, if it was written in the original note. He mispronounced several of them, always the names that had come through territories other than English, and she made him say each one again until he got it right. On the 14th evening he read through 120 names without looking at the ledger. She tested him by giving him the location first and asking for the name. He missed 4. On the 15th evening he missed 1. He stopped at 1 entry. Alone. Green Island. 67 years old. He said the age out loud and then said nothing else for a moment. "A 67-year-old woman," he said. "Keep reading," Mara said. He kept reading. On the morning of the 16th day she put the tin cup back on the stone edge, filled it to the same place, and did not explain why she had returned to it. He looked at the cup. She said nothing. He extended his arm, dropped the shoulder, let the weight shift down and back in the particular sequence she had been building toward for 16 days, and he lifted the cup to chest height. He held it there. The surface of the water made one small movement and then went still. He tilted the cup over the spring edge and poured it out slowly, controlled, without spillage along the rim, set it back on the stone. Not one drop on the rock. He was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. It came out as one short, rough sound, the kind that hadn't been used enough to come out smoothly, and it was louder than either of them had anticipated. Somewhere in the pine trees below the spring ledge a bird broke cover and flew, startled, and the sound of its wings faded into the canyon, and then there was just the steam rising off the water and the silence. His left hand came up halfway toward his face and stopped in the air, as though he were checking whether that sound had actually come from him. He left his hand there for several seconds. Mara turned away from him and looked at the canyon wall, and said nothing for long enough that the moment could belong to him without anyone witnessing it. That, she said, when she could speak without her voice doing something she hadn't planned, is the first thing I have watched you do since I came here that wasn't meant to prove something to someone. I don't remember the last time, he said. He didn't complete it. He didn't need to. That afternoon she brought the actual picture. It was a brass piece from the ranch house sideboard, the kind used for formal occasions, wide-bodied and heavy, even without anything in it. She filled it with water to the weight she had been told to expect for the ceremony and set it on the stone table at the edge of the yard. He stood across from it and looked at it for a long time, without making any move. She let him look. Whatever was happening in the space between him and that object was not something she could accelerate. When he reached for it, he was precise. Shoulder dropped, weight engaged below and behind, the chain of small muscular decisions that had been 3 weeks in the building. He lifted the picture off the table and held it at table height. His arm began to drop at the 11-second mark. Slowly, then with increasing certainty, the picture descending toward the table, despite everything the right arm was asking of it. Mara was there before she had made a conscious decision to move. Both hands went under his wrist from below, and she braced, and the picture's descent slowed and stopped, and they stood together beside the stone table with the brass pitcher between them and her hands under his wrist and his arm resting in the brace she had made, and neither of them moved for 5 seconds. 6. She could feel a pulse under her right thumb and could not determine whether it was hers or his. That's enough, she said. Her voice was not as even as she wanted it to be. Put it down. They lowered it together. When it was back on the table, she kept her hands in place for 1 more second, then released. She picked up the work cloth and turned to fold it. Nearly 5 pounds, she said. You held it to table height. 3 days left. 3 days, he said in a voice she had not heard from him before. Something had come loose in it. Nothing dramatic. Just the sound of a man who had been holding something for a very long time and had just set it down by a fraction. She picked up the cloth and did not look at his face. 30 more names tonight, she said, starting from M. Don't rush through them to finish. She went home that afternoon because her mother's medical records needed to be brought to the county physician's office in Renly A on the following Monday, and Cora had said they were on top of the wardrobe in the tin box along with the other papers. Mara pulled the chair over and stepped up and brought the box down and opened the lid and took out the physician's file. When she pulled it free, 2 sheets of paper folded into quarters slipped out from under it and fell to the floor separately. She picked them up. She meant to put them back in the box. Then she didn't. She sat down at the kitchen table and unfolded the older of the 2. In 6 years she had held this document many times, always with the same purpose, to look at the number at the bottom of the last page and then fold it closed again, the way you looked at a bruise to see whether it was getting worse and then covered it back up. She had never read what was above the number. She read it now. 3 paragraphs, dense set, written in the kind of legal language that was designed to require reading twice before the meaning surfaced. She read the first paragraph and the second, and partway through the third, she stopped. She went back to the second paragraph and found the phrase again, and read it 3 times to make sure it was saying what she thought it was saying. Replacement consolidation instrument. She read the rest. She read it to the bottom of the page, all the way to the final line in the lower right corner, where the Wyoming Lending Trust mark always appeared on documents of this type, the small circular seal with the family name, which she had seen on the Harmon blacksmith's paper, and on the Reinhardt dry goods paper, and on the papers of every family in the valley whose name appeared in the ledger she had been hearing, read aloud for 15 consecutive evenings. There was no seal. There was only a handwritten signature in the lower right corner, in a hand she recognized from the papers she had seen at the inn table 3 weeks ago. Slanted, precise, the initial R, a period and then the surname. Vess. Mara sat without moving. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been. The lamp was in the same place. The stove was the same stove. Nothing had changed in the room, and everything had changed in the room. She looked at the upper left corner of the document where the date was stamped. Then she put the document on the table and went to the bottom of the stairs and called for her mother. Cora came down with her cane, one careful step at a time, and when she reached the kitchen she looked at Mara's face and then looked at the table without sitting down. "When did you get this?" Mara asked. Cora came to the table and looked at the paper. "A man delivered it," she said. "This was perhaps 4 months or so after your father passed. I was still not well enough to manage the stairs easily, and you were at work." He left it in the mailbox at the gate. There was a note fastened to it saying the original agreement had been superseded, and that this was the document that now governed the account. "I assumed it was a standard legal procedure, Mom." Mara's voice came out strangely. She heard it and could not entirely account for what was strange about it. "I need to count something." She counted. The date on the document was 3 months and 11 days after the date her father had died. She looked at the signature again. She looked at the date again. She folded the paper along the existing creases, which were the creases that someone other than her mother had made in it, tighter, more deliberate, and put it in the inside pocket of her vest where she kept the other paper, the one with Everett's signature across the bottom. "I need to take this with me for a short while," she said. Cora asked no questions. This was one of her great gifts, this particular economy. She had an instinct for when a question would be useful, and when it would only take up space that was needed for something else. She simply stood with her hand on the back of the kitchen chair and watched her daughter put on her vest and her coat and go back out to the yard, where the mare was still tied to the post. Mara rode to Hollow Pine in the time it took to ride to Hollow Pine and could not afterward have described any part of the road. Everett was in the dining room, with the ledger open and a cup of coffee going cold on the side table. He looked up when she came through the door, registered something in the angle of her arrival, and was already setting down his pen when she put the paper on the table in front of him. She said nothing. She pointed at the lower right corner. He looked at it for a long time, a longer time than was necessary to read what was there. He was not reading it multiple times. He was sitting with it, which was different. He called for Hetty. She appeared from the back of the house, wiping her hands on her apron, and he asked whether his father's strongbox in the storeroom could still be opened. She said she still had the key. He asked her to bring whatever was inside it to the dining room table. She was gone for nearly 20 minutes. When she came back, she was carrying an old account ledger, the kind with ruled columns drawn by hand inside the covers, the kind that bookkeepers had used when they did not trust printed forms and wanted the numbers to carry the weight of the person who had written them. She set it on the table beside the other documents and opened it to the section for S. Her father kept a parallel record, she said. He didn't trust figures he hadn't written himself. He believed that a printed ledger could be altered without too much difficulty, but that changing handwritten entries, one by one, required someone to sit down and do it deliberately, line by line, which was a different category of effort and left a different kind of evidence. She ran her finger down the page to the entry for Sutton, Renoulier. She read the original amount. She moved to the payment column and read each entry in sequence, month by month. Mara stood at the end of the table and listened to her father's debt being retired in the handwriting of a dead man, the numbers steady, the gaps between them regular, the way they would be if someone had made the payments without variance, without exception, without missing a single month. Hetty stopped at the final entry. $1,800 remaining, she said. Recorded in that month. She looked up. There are no further entries. The room was quiet. Everett was still looking at the document Mara had brought. The date on this, he said. Mara told him. Hetty placed one hand flat on the table edge. That was the week you were in the hospital, she said. I remember it because I was not at the ranch. I was in Cheyenne, at the physician's office for 3 days, waiting for news of you. Everett said nothing for a considerable time. He did not strike the table, or stand abruptly, or make any of the physical declarations of anger that were available to a man his size. He simply sat with both hands placed on either side of the document and looked at it, and the quality of his stillness was different from his usual stillness in a way that Mara could feel from the far end of the table. $1,800, he said, became $96,000. Yes, on a document that doesn't carry this family's mark. Yes. He looked up at Hetty. How many of my father's ledgers do you have? 7, going back to 1871. There is a separate volume for the Northern Branch accounts. Bring all of them out, he said. Start with the Northern Branch. Check every name, the original amount, the total paid against it, the current figure in my ledger, and whether a replacement document was issued, when, and whose signature is on it. Can you do it in 2 days? She was already standing. I can do it in 1.5, she said, and she went out of the dining room toward the back of the house without pausing. Mara stood at the table and looked at the man sitting at the other end of it. She had expected to feel relieved. That was what she had assumed relief would feel like when it arrived, some release of the thing that had been pressing against her sternum for 6 years, some loosening of the chronic tension that had become so familiar. She had stopped perceiving it as tension and had started perceiving it as simply the shape of her days. Instead, she stood in the dining room of Hollow Pine Ranch and felt cold and clear and quietly furious. And she was thinking about her mother at the kitchen table in Renelier for 6 years, sorting the money and counting forward and counting the gap and going to bed and getting up and doing it again. And no one had told her that the number she was working toward was a number that had been written on a paper by a man who had driven out to her property while her husband was freshly in the ground and slipped a document into her mailbox and told her the old paper was no longer valid. What are you going to do? She asked. Everett picked up the replacement document, folded it along the creases it already had, and held it out to her. Put it back exactly where it was, he said. In that box. Don't keep it anywhere else and don't tell anyone you took it. Then he walked to the doorway and stopped there with his back to her. 3 days, he said. You make sure this arm can hold that picture. Leave the rest where it sits. She took the paper. She stood in the dining room after he had gone and looked at the parallel ledger still open on the table, her father's handwriting in the payment column, regular and patient as a man's footsteps, right up to the last entry, and then nothing. The nothing where the story stopped because he had stopped. She closed the ledger. She went out through the side door and found her horse and rode home. The sun was behind the ridge by the time she reached the home yard. She unsaddled and fed the mare and came in through the kitchen door and found her mother at the table with the lamp on and the pill case open, sorting the week's medications into their compartments the way she did every Sunday. Cora looked up and then looked back at the pill case and continued sorting. Mara sat across from her. They stayed like that for a while, the lamp between them and the pill case making its small clicks as each compartment closed. Did you know, Mara finally said, how close he was to paying it off? The pill case clicked. I found out, Cora said, after, when I was well enough to go through the desk drawer myself. Your father had kept his own record in the back of the household account book. I found it in January. He was within 2 months of finishing. She set the pill case aside. Then I got the paper in the mailbox and I believed it. Mara looked at her mother's hands on the table. She had looked at those hands every day of her life, and she had learned to read them, the way she had learned to read everything, by the quality of how they rested, whether they pressed or floated, whether the tendons at the wrist stood up or lay flat. Right now they were very still. The stillness of someone who has decided not to spend energy on what cannot be changed and is conserving it for what might be. I need to ask you something, Mara said. Cora waited. Do you trust him? Her mother was quiet for long enough that Mara began to understand that the silence was not hesitation, but consideration, which was different. Then, I trust that he told you the truth about being afraid to lose you, Cora said. A man who is willing to tell a woman he was afraid of something, that's a specific kind of honesty. Most men spend their whole lives rearranging the truth to avoid that particular admission. She stood and picked up the pill case and carried it to the shelf. That's different from trusting the situation, she said. The situation is still what it is. I know, Mara said. Cora came back to the table, and stood behind the chair rather than sitting in it. The lamp put shadows under her eyes that made her look older, in a way that Mara saw sometimes in the evening and tried not to look at directly. "Go to bed," she said. "You have to be up before 4. Mara went upstairs. She lay down without undressing. She looked at the ceiling of her room, which she had looked at on a great many nights in the past 3 years under a great many different weights, and she thought about the ledger in her father's hand and the number that had stopped in the middle of its own story. She thought about a man sitting at the end of a dining room table with his hands placed flat on either side of a document he hadn't written, being still in the way that was different from his other stillness. She thought about the nail that Roland Vess had told her was real, and she thought about the qualifier Everett had attached to it, not on Vess's page, on mine. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, it was without intending to, and when she woke, it was because the darkness outside the window had gone from the full black of deep night to the particular dark gray that came just before the sky committed to anything, which meant she had less than an hour before she needed to be back on the road. She got up. She put water on the stove. She stood at the kitchen window in the gray pre-dawn and looked out at the yard and the pines beyond it, and thought about what it meant that she had spent 16 days trying to teach a man to trust his own shoulder, when the shoulder's entire problem was that it had spent over a year trusting nothing within arm's reach. She drank her water and went out to saddle the mare and began the ride north in the dark. And the thing she was thinking about, the thing she could not stop thinking about, was the difference between pain and fear, which she had told him was the first thing she would teach him, which she had been teaching him for 16 days, and which she was now, on the 40-minute ride through Wyoming dark, beginning to understand. She had not yet finished learning herself. The rider came at 3 in the morning. Mara heard the horse before she heard the knock, the particular sound of a horse that had been pushed and was blowing hard in the yard, not the measured arrival of someone who had traveled at a reasonable pace. She was awake already, which had become her normal condition in the hours between midnight and the alarm she had stopped needing to set. She went to the window before going to the door. A single rider. The horse was dark-colored and still shifting its weight the way horses did when they had not yet decided the journey was finished. The rider had dismounted and was at the door. She came downstairs. The man on the porch was one of Amos Pruitt's hands, a young one she recognized from the gate, still wearing the canvas work coat he'd been in when she had last seen him 3 days ago. He held out a folded paper without speaking. She took it. He waited. She read it in the lamplight she had brought with her from the kitchen, holding it close enough that the flame was almost touching the edge. "The council meeting has been moved forward." The note was in a hand she did not recognize, someone writing from dictation rather than composing. "The new date places the ceremony on the 19th day from the day the agreement was made. That means 11 days remain. The 4 other houses signed the revised schedule this afternoon." Then, in different ink, as though added after the original message had been completed, a single line in Roland Vess's own hand, which she recognized from the signature on her mother's fraudulent paper. "He will tell you, it changes nothing. Watch his jaw." She folded the note. The rider was still waiting. She told him there was no response and went back inside and stood in the kitchen, with the lamp, the folded note, and the specific cold that came from understanding that someone had been watching the shape of this situation carefully enough to predict not only what Everett would say, but what she would be looking for when he said it. She did not go back to bed. She sat at the kitchen table until the gray began outside, then saddled the mare before the house was fully awake and rode north without leaving a message for her mother, because there was nothing she could have written that would not have required a longer conversation than the hour allowed. She arrived at Hollow Pine before 6. Everett was already at the spring, which had become his habit on the mornings she came. He was always there first, positioned and waiting, as though arriving after her would have constituted some kind of concession he was unwilling to make. He had his back to the path when she came down the stone steps. She went to the edge of the spring and stood and told him. Day 19, 11 days. The 4 houses signed yesterday afternoon. She watched his jaw. It did exactly what Vess had told her it would do. The muscle below his right ear drew tight for 1 full second. Held. Released. Precise as a lock turning. and she felt the same cold collapse in her chest she had felt the previous night reading the note in the lamplight. Because what she had been hoping, without fully acknowledging she had been hoping it, was that Vess would be wrong about this one thing. That the jaw would stay still, and the hope would be real, and the nail on his page would turn out to be something less structural than she feared. Then she saw the corner of his mouth move. It was not the shadow of a smile, which was what she had seen on the porch the first night. This was something altogether different. Sharper. More awake than anything she had seen on him in 18 days. The expression of a man who has just watched someone make a move, and has understood, immediately and completely, what that move has cost them. He just made the worst decision of his life, Everett said. And he doesn't know it yet. Sit down, Mara said. I don't understand any of this. He sat on the granite edge and looked at the water for a moment before speaking. Do you remember when I told you the nail was on my page? She said she remembered. Vess drafted the assurance while I was flat on my back and unable to respond to it. His entire mind, when he wrote it, was fixed on one problem. How to ensure that when I fell, everything moved cleanly and legally into the hands of the other 4 houses. He drafted it very well. He is a precise man, and he left very little room. He looked at the steam rising off the water. But he was so focused on writing the trap that he never sat down and asked himself what the document permitted a man who managed to get back on his feet to do. Because in his thinking, that possibility didn't exist. Mara sat down a short distance from him. Article 9, Section 4. Everett's voice was level, instructive, stripped of anything personal. He wrote it for the final contingency, the part that applies if the head of the family successfully completes the ceremony. He wrote it because a man who has just recovered authority after 14 months of uncertainty needs to be able to move quickly, to sign decisions, settle questions, put things in order without waiting for committee agreement. He paused. He wrote that provision so I could reassure people fast. 3 days of full authority, no review required, immediate effect on anything signed. He thought he was giving a recovering man a window to stabilize. She said it before he finished. He built the lock and never tried turning it the other way. That is correct. And the ledger, she said slowly, the way you spoke when the words were more than you thought they were going to be when you started them. The 412 instruments. They fall inside that authority. Everything falls inside that authority. Whatever I sign during those 72 hours takes immediate effect and requires no approval from any of the 5 houses. She stood up, walked 3 steps, turned back. If you complete the ceremony, you have 3 days to do anything you choose with the ledger. I'm telling you what the document says. He looked at her. I haven't told you what I intend to do with it. She stopped. Why? Because you haven't asked me what it costs. He turned his right hand over and looked at the palm. Not performing the gesture, examining it, the way you examined something you owned and were considering the weight of. The ledger is the collateral I pledged. You understand that now. If I touch it in the way you're thinking, then the security disappears from the hands of the people currently holding it. And when security disappears, this house has nothing left beneath it. The other 4 families assume control within a week, legally, without anyone having broken a single rule or fired a single round. He looked up at her. I can preserve 400 names, he said, or I can preserve my own. There is no configuration in which I keep both. Mara stood beside the spring, and the words she had been about to say arranged themselves somewhere in the region of her throat and did not come out. She had spent 18 days believing. She understood the dimensions of what she was standing inside. She had thought she was treating a shoulder in exchange for a document. She had understood that the document had limits. She had understood that Vess had built his own exposure into the assurance he had written. What she had not understood until right now was that all of those things were details inside a story, with a much larger question at its center, and that she had been moving through that story without seeing the question, because she had been too close to one specific number to see what surrounded it. Which one will you choose? She asked. He rose from the granite edge, and she noticed they both noticed that he rose more easily than he had on Monday, with less negotiations between his body and the act of standing upright. And neither of them said anything about it, which was its own kind of statement. Today we work on foundation, he said. You told me 2 days ago the shoulder can't carry the load alone. Don't do that, Miss Sutton. His voice was not cold. It was finished, which was different. In 11 days I have to lift a brass pitcher with my right arm in front of 60 people. If I fail to do that, everything I've just described belongs to someone else's story, and the 400 names go with it. He extended his right arm, palm facing upward, the position she had established in the third session, the one that meant, give me an honest assessment, not the one you think I need. You came here to fix this arm, fix it. She looked at that hand for a long time. She thought about all the things she could say. All the things that were true and urgent and that a reasonable person would consider necessary to address before moving on to elbow exercises on a granite shelf in Wyoming. She thought about her mother sorting pills at the kitchen table. She thought about Vess riding 3 hours through the dark to knock on a door because a man who had already won didn't do that. She thought about the nail on his page. She thought about what it meant that he had told her the nail was there, and then told her to leave it where it sat and gone back inside. Then she knelt on the work cloth and went to work. The shoulder had changed under her hands in the last 3 sessions. Not dramatically, nothing about this was dramatic, which was part of why it was working. The drama of an injury was in its first presentation. The work of healing it was in the accumulation of small, undramatic adjustments over time, each one too minor to celebrate on its own, but collectively constituting something that registered as progress when you pressed your thumb into the same point you had been pressing for 18 days, and found that your thumb could go deeper than it went yesterday, without the muscle slamming shut around it. She had half an inch now, where she'd had a quarter. She had the zone below the shoulder blade firing in a partial reluctant way that it had not been firing at all when she started. She had a neck that for the first time in over a year was not doing the work of 3 separate muscle groups. Simultaneously, she worked for 40 minutes without speaking except to give instruction. He followed every instruction without argument, which had been true from the beginning but which she had come to think of as one of the more remarkable things about the arrangement, that a man who ran 40,000 acres with something close to absolute authority could be told to press his elbow into a rock and hold it there, and do so without questioning the purpose. There was a kind of discipline in that which she had not expected, and had not found a name for. When she was finished, she wiped her hands and sat back on her heels. "I'll ask you tomorrow what you've decided," she said. He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. She went through the gate and rode south toward Renelier, and the morning was cold enough that she could see her breath and the mare's, 2 small clouds of warmth moving through Wyoming fall, and she thought about what it meant to have a choice between your name and 400 other names. She thought about what kind of man made that choice in one direction, and what kind made it in the other. She thought about the fact that he had told her the choice existed at all, when he could have simply made it without telling her, and she would never have known what the alternative was. She was still thinking about it when she reached the home yard. Cora was on the porch. This was unusual. Cora did not sit on the porch in the morning as a rule, because the morning air was hard on her chest, and the physician had been clear on the subject. She was sitting in the wooden chair nearest the door, with her good wool shawl around her shoulders and her cane across her knees, and she had the look of someone who had been sitting there long enough to have already worked through what she wanted to say. Mara tied the mare and came up the porch steps and sat in the other chair. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The pines beyond the fence were letting go of last night's cold slowly, the frost still visible on the north-facing surfaces where the sun hadn't reached yet. "I've been thinking," Cora said, "about the night your father came home and told me the bill was gone." Mara waited. "I asked him once, about a year later, whether the terms were fair. He thought about it for a while before he answered. He said they were what they were. He said that the man he dealt with had been direct about the interest and direct about the consequence of missing a payment, and that there was a kind of fairness in that even if the overall structure wasn't something you'd choose if you had options." She adjusted the shawl. "He wasn't a foolish man, your father, but he also wasn't a man who expected people who held power over him to be anything other than what they were." Mara looked at the fence line. "I'm not telling you to trust the situation," Cora said. "I told you that before, and it's still true. The situation is constructed by men who have interests that are not your interests. What I'm telling you is something different." She turned in the chair to look at her daughter directly. I'm telling you to look at what he actually did with the information he had. He knew what that paper said about us. He's known from the first night. And what he did with that knowledge was ask you a question instead of using it. That's a low bar, Mara said. It is. Most bars that matter are lower than we want them to be. The frost on the fence posts was going now, the far side of each post dripping where the sun had come through. I'm afraid, Mara said. It came out without the preparation she usually gave to saying something true. She hadn't decided to say it. It had simply moved through the gap the way things move through gaps in this particular season of her life. Cora didn't rush to fill the space after it. She let it sit there, which was the correct response and also the harder one. I know, she said eventually. You have been afraid for 3 years, and you have done every single thing you needed to do anyway. She reached over and placed her hand over Mara's hand on the chair arm, held it there for 3 or 4 seconds, then lifted it and put it back in her own lap. That is what afraid looks like when it belongs to a person like you. It looks like riding north before dawn and putting your hands on something broken and making it work again. Mara sat with that. She's never asked it, Cora said. Not in a way that would land the right way, but I want to ask it now. How are you? Not the situation. Not the paper. You. Mara looked at the porch boards beneath her boots, the old wood, weathered gray, the grain raised where enough winters had passed over it. Her father had replaced 2 boards on the far end the summer, before he got sick, and you could still tell which ones they were because they were a slightly different shade. I don't know yet, she said. But I think I'm closer to knowing than I was 2 weeks ago. Cora nodded once. That's something. After a while they went inside, and Mara made coffee, and her mother sat at the kitchen table, and they did not talk about Everett Cane or the ledger or the 11 days or what Mara had learned that morning. They talked about the north fence and whether the winter wood was stacked high enough, and whether the physician had said anything definitive about the new medication at the last appointment. They talked about the small, specific things that constituted a life, which were the same things before any of this had started, and would be the same things after. It was Amos who came to find her in the late afternoon. He rode into the home yard at a pace that was not urgent but was fastest than social, and he took off his hat when he reached the porch, which Mara had come to understand was his signal that what he was about to say was something he had been instructed to say carefully. He told her that Mr. Cane wanted her to know that he understood if she had questions about her initial assessment of the situation. He told her that if she did, Mr. Cane had asked him to be honest with her about what he knew. Mara looked at him. What does that mean? Amos looked at his hat brim. The night you came to the ranch, he said, I compiled a report on you. It's standard when there's a security incident on the property. I sent it up to Mr. Cane at about 11 o'clock that night. He asked me to, before he spoke to you on the porch. She waited. The report had 7 items, Amos said. He wasn't looking at her face. Item 4 was the lending instrument on your property. The amount, the date of issue, the current balance which branch held it. The yard was very quiet. The mare was at the water trough making small sounds against the rim of the bucket. He already had it when he made the offer, Mara said. Yes. Before I told him what we owed. Yes. Amos put his hat back on. I'm telling you because he asked me to, he said. He wanted you to hear it from me rather than figure it out on your own and not know for certain. He said you would figure it out eventually regardless. She looked at the fence line. Thank you, she said. Amos touched the brim of his hat and rode back the way he had come. Mara stood on the porch until the sound of his horse was gone, and then she sat down in the chair her mother had been in that morning, and she let the thought come. The full thought, the one she had been keeping at the edge of her consciousness for 18 days, approaching it and then turning away from it, the way you approached something hot carefully, with your hands low. He had known exactly what the Sutton debt weighed from the first hour, which meant that when he sat on the back porch and made the offer, he had already calculated the precise pressure point. He hadn't let her name the price in a vacuum. He had waited while a woman who desperately needed something told him what she needed, and then he had offered it back to her in the form of a bargain. He had allowed her to believe that 30 days of her hands on his shoulder was a fair exchange for her mother's freedom, while knowing the whole time that what he was trading was something he held at a significant discount from face value authority over a debt that, under the terms of a fraudulent replacement document, should never have reached the number it had reached. And the coat. She had kept the coat in a particular interior place since the first night, somewhere she hadn't examined too directly, because examining it directly felt like it would change what it was. Now she took it out and looked at it in the light of what she now knew, a man who had full knowledge of what she owed, who had seen, in the same glance, the bruises on her arm and the vulnerability of everything attached to her name in his ledger. What ran through a man like that when he saw those things? Genuine feeling? Or 3 words in sequence: this person needs, and I have. She sat with that for a long time. The sun dropped behind the western ridge and the temperature dropped with it, the way it dropped fast in the canyon country once the light was gone, and Mara sat on the porch and did not go inside. Cora came to the door eventually. "You're not coming in. I'm sitting a while longer." Cora pushed the door open and came out, carefully, leaning on the cane, and lowered herself into the chair Mara had vacated earlier. She didn't turn the porch lamp on. The dark was the particular deep blue of early autumn evening in Wyoming, and the first stars were appearing over the eastern ridge in the places where the sky was clearest. "Are you thinking about not going tomorrow?" Cora asked. Mara said nothing for a moment. "I don't know what I'm going there as anymore. If all of this was a way to keep me working, if the coat was a calculation from the beginning, then what am I in that room? What's the honest word for it?" Cora was quiet. The pines moved slightly. Somewhere across the south pasture a night bird made its single-note call and then went silent. "I told you that kindness from the person holding your ledger is weather," Cora said. "I stand by that. I haven't changed a word of it." She pulled the shawl tighter. "But I'll tell you something else now, and you should hear it as something separate from the first thing. For 3 years you have walked into rooms where you already knew what you were going to find. You walked into the legal aid office and you already knew what the attorney would say. You walked into the bank and you already knew what the manager would say. When you walk into a room knowing, you only hear what you already expected to hear, and you can't help it, because knowing and hearing have the same shape from the inside." She turned in the chair. "Tomorrow is different. Tomorrow you don't know, so go," she said. "But go without believing anyone. Don't believe him and don't believe the man who sends notes at 3 in the morning either. Walk into that room without trusting any version of the story you've already been told. It's the only way you'll still be able to see clearly. And tomorrow, Mara, I believe someone in that room is going to need at least one person who can see." Mara sat with her mother in the dark and looked at the stars coming up over the ridge and thought about clarity, about what it felt like to be the person who read bodies instead of words, about what it had cost her father to be precise and regular, and never miss a payment right up to the month he couldn't anymore, about what it cost a man who had been treated like something precious to sit beside a stranger for 40 minutes without saying a word. A second note arrived just before they went inside. A different rider this time, younger, who handed it over the gate without dismounting and was gone before she could ask who had sent it. The handwriting was Vess's, Miss Sutton. "Before you sleep, ask yourself one question. Why specifically were your hands required for this? Of all the people available to a man of his reach, why did it have to be you?" She read it twice, folded it, put it in her vest pocket beside the other paper, the one with Everett's signature. She thought about the question on the walk back to the porch. She thought about it while she helped her mother through the door and set the lamp on the kitchen table and put water on the stove. She thought about it while she sat across from her mother and they drank their tea in the ordinary silence of 2 people who lived together and did not need to perform for each other. The question was designed to make her feel used. She understood that. It was designed to introduce a specific kind of doubt, the doubt that came from asking whether a thing was chosen for the right reasons or the convenient ones. Vess had been introducing specifically shaped doubts from the beginning, each one delivered at the correct moment for maximum structural damage, each one containing just enough truth to make the surrounding architecture plausible. But there was a version of the question that was not a weapon. There was a version she could ask herself, honestly, in the quiet of the kitchen, without Vess's handwriting on it. Why specifically were her hands required? Not because she was available, Not because she was cheap or compromised by debt into compliance. 4 doctors from cities all across the territory had said the same thing about his arm, and none of them had been useful. She had been standing in a cooling spring for 3 hours and had managed to say in one unrehearsed sentence what none of them had said in 14 months of deliberate examination. Because in 14 months he had told her, "You are the only person who looked at me and said what was actually broken." She put her cup down on the table. "The others looked and told me what I was paying them to say." She sat with that sentence for a long time. Long enough that her mother finished her tea and rinsed the cup and said good night and went upstairs. Long enough that the lamp burned lower and needed trimming, which she did without fully registering that she was doing it. Long enough that the question Vess had asked her began to separate from the version Vess had intended it to be and become something she could look at directly. Why specifically were her hands required? Because broken things spoke to her in a language she had learned in the dark, in a room where the sick person pretended to sleep so the well person could do her work without feeling worse about it. Because she had spent 3 years becoming the kind of person who could hear damage before it announced itself. Because she had stood in the cooling water and looked at a man holding his own wrist and known, without deciding to know what was wrong with him. That was not leverage. That was not a calculation. That was a pair of hands that had been made by specific losses into a specific instrument, and someone had recognized the instrument for what it was, and had been direct about needing it. She went upstairs. She lay down. The lamp was out and the room was dark, and the question about the coat sat at the far edge of her thinking, not resolved but no longer sharp in the same way. Because the honest answer to whether the coat was compassion or strategy was the same answer Everett had given her when she asked him about Deke Rourke, which was that he didn't know. Which was not a satisfying answer, and which was, for that exact reason, the only answer she had ever found trustworthy. She closed her eyes. She thought about 11 days. She thought about the way he had stood up from the spring ledge more easily this morning, and how neither of them had mentioned it, and how the not mentioning had been a kind of acknowledgement more precise than anything either of them could have said out loud. And she thought just before sleep pulled her under about what Cora had said, that tomorrow was different, because tomorrow she didn't know, and that the not knowing, which had been the source of every difficulties, since the night she had opened her mother's door to find a man with a well-ridden horse standing in the dark, was also the only condition under which she had ever been able to see anything clearly. She would go tomorrow. She had known she would go from the moment the first note arrived. She would go, and she would not believe Vess, and she would not believe Everett, and she would walk into whatever room they put her in with her hands and her eyes and the specific knowledge that she had built out of years of listening to things that didn't speak in words, and she would see what was there, because that was the only thing she had ever known how to do, and because someone in that room, Cora had said, would need it. She was asleep before she finished deciding whether her mother was right. They took the train to Denver. Mara had not been on a train in 4 years, and the combination of coal smoke and iron and the rhythmic percussion of wheels on track brought back the one time her father had taken her south as a girl, when she was old enough to help with the auction paperwork, but still young enough to find the motion of the cars genuinely extraordinary. That had been a different world. A world in which the tin box on the wardrobe held nothing more significant than land deeds, and the name Cane was simply the name of a large ranch in the northern valley rather than the shape of everything her family owed. She sat in the passenger car with her hands in her lap and watched Wyoming pass through the window and did not try to reconcile the two versions of herself, because they didn't reconcile, and forcing them to would have consumed energy she needed for other things. Hetty sat beside her. This had been Everett's arrangement, communicated through Amos, without explanation, as most of Everett's arrangements where Hetty would accompany Mara under the recognized standing of the ranch's head of household, a status among the 5 families that Mara did not fully understand, but which Hetty had indicated, in her compressed way, was sufficient to place them in the room without question. Everett traveled in a separate car forward. She did not see him board at the Rennelia station. She did not see him at any point during the journey south, which was 4 hours through canyon country and then high plains, and which gave her 4 hours to think about what she intended to do when she was standing in a room with 60 people who had all come to watch a hand either hold or fail. She had decided, somewhere in the second hour with the pale grass moving outside the window, that she was going to do the thing her mother had told her to do. Walk in without believing anyone. Not Everett's version of what was going to happen. Not Vess's version. Not the version she had assembled herself from 23 days of sessions and correspondence and late nights on the porch. Walk in with nothing but her own eyes and her own hands, and the knowledge that those two things had never yet failed to show her what was actually there. The building in Denver where the councils met was not a government building. It was a former hotel dining room on a side street east of the main commercial district, the kind of place that had been something prosperous once and had been converted to a purpose that required privacy rather than foot traffic. The windows were covered on the inside with dark wool curtains pulled to the edge of each frame. 2 oil lamps on iron stands flanked the entrance. Mara arrived with Hetty by hired coach in the late morning, and when she stepped down onto the street, the air was colder than Wyoming had been that morning. The Denver autumn carrying a harder edge than the valley. Vess was already inside. Hetty knew this and said so in the coach, along with the other information Mara needed. 5 families, 10 to 12 representatives each, Clara Whitmore as senior voice with final weight on procedural questions, ceremony first and business second, no weapons permitted past the entrance. Everyone stands for the ceremony, no one sits. This was traditional and also practical. Whatever happened would be visible to the entire room at once, with nowhere to hide and no position of advantage for anyone watching. They entered through a side door that Hetty led her to without hesitation, which confirmed what Mara had already understood, that the old woman had been present for gatherings like this one more than once, and that her knowledge of this building was not academic. The room was longer than it appeared from the street. The single table ran down the center, already set. Along both walls, people were arranging themselves in the patient, deliberate way of people who understood ceremony and did not need to be directed through it. Men in dark wool vests and work coats, women in calico and muslin with their hair dressed formally, the way you dressed when you were representing something larger than your own preferences. Mara counted without appearing to count. 50, perhaps more, still filing through the main entrance. All standing, all quiet. She took her position at the far end of the room, against the wall, where she could see the full length of the table without being read as part of the official arrangement. The brass pitcher sat at the head of the table. 5 glasses beside it. The family record, open. A pen horizontal to the right of the record, and the flat gray steel box she recognized from Everett's study, closed, sitting to the left of everything else. She looked at the box for a moment longer than she needed to, and then she looked away. Vess moved through the room with the ease of long familiarity, speaking briefly to people along the walls, adjusting the placement of papers at the head of the table with the precise, unhurried movements of a man who had arranged this exact configuration many times before. He paused when he reached her position. He slowed his pace just enough to say, quietly, without breaking his stride, "You came to watch. I hope you can bear what you're about to see." Then he kept moving, toward the 4 other family heads taking their seats, toward the position he had already selected for himself at the table's edge. No malice in how he said it. That remained, still, the most difficult thing about Roland Vess. The pleasantness was not a surface over something crueler underneath. It was its own substance, and it was harder to stand against than cruelty would have been, because cruelty at least gave you something clear to push back from. Mara looked at the room. She's looked at the people arranged along both walls and understood what her mother had meant about clarity. Every person in that room had arrived with a version of this morning already written. Some had come hoping for one outcome, some for another. All of them were watching through the lens of what they expected, which was the lens that most reliably produced blindness in the moments that mattered. She was not going to be blind today. She fixed her eyes on the main door. Everett came through it at 10 o'clock. He came alone, which meant Amos had stayed with the horses, which meant he had chosen to walk into this room without anyone at his back. He wore his formal dark wool coat, the one she had not seen before this week, collar up and front buttoned, and his boots had been cleaned, but not polished, dressed for the occasion but still, unmistakably, a man who worked with his hands and had not attempted to disguise the fact. He was the largest person in the room by a margin that registered immediately on everyone present. When he moved through the gathering near the entrance, people did not step aside for him exactly. They simply found, without deciding to, that there was room where he was going that had not been there a moment before. He did not look toward the far end of the room. Not a glance, not the small involuntary pull of the eyes that people performed without knowing they were performing it. He walked to his position at the head of the table, and stood and looked at the picture in front of him and nowhere else. And Mara stood at the far end of the room, and felt the deliberate not looking the way you felt the absence of something that had been present and was now withheld. It arrived in the center of her chest with specific weight. She had prepared herself for a number of things this morning. She had not prepared for that particular sensation, and she did not have a clean name for it, which meant she filed it in the same category as everything else she had encountered in 23 days that did not yet have a name, and she kept her eyes on the room. Clara Whitmore sat at the table's midpoint on the left side, white-haired, straight-backed, wearing a dark dress with a brooch at the throat that caught the lamplight once, when she turned her head. She had the face of someone who had made enough consequential decisions to stop finding them remarkable. Beside her, and across from her, the 4 other family heads in the order the original compact had established. No one explained anything. Everyone in the room already understood it, which was precisely the point of a ritual that had been in place long enough to become its own kind of language. Everett reached out and took hold of the brass pitcher. The room went completely still. Not performed stillness. The actual cessation of internal motion, the held breath of 50 people who had stopped whatever they had been doing inside themselves and were now simply waiting, collectively, in the same suspended moment. He lifted the pitcher. Mara saw him do it, and her hands closed at her sides without her deciding. Because what she was watching was the result of 23 days of work, conducted in the cold mornings, beside a thermal spring in Wyoming, and watching the result of work you have done with your hands is not a neutral experience. It has a physical dimension. It lives in the chest as much as in the eyes. He did everything in the correct sequence. Not because he was following a mental list, because the sequence had become structural over 23 mornings. Shoulder dropped first, weight shifted into the zone below, and behind the shoulder blade, the arm moving as a single integrated mechanism, rather than as separate parts compensating for one another's failures. The pitcher came up from the table to chest height, and held there without any movement at all, the brass surface absolutely still in the lamplight. He tilted it over the first glass. The wine came out in an unbroken pour, continuous and clean, and he brought the pitcher upright before the last drop fell, and not a single drop gathered at the lip. The second glass. The third. On the fourth, a man on the right wall shifted his weight, and his boot heel scraped the floor. A sound as loud as a knocked plank in the silence of that room. The pitcher did not move. The 4th glass. The 5th. He set the pitcher down, and it met the table without sound, placed rather than set down, with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that the last 3 inches mattered as much as everything before them. Nothing on the table. Not one drop. The family record was pushed toward him, already open to the correct page. He took the pen in his right hand and signed. 5 people seated at the table leaned slightly forward to observe the handwriting as it was made. Clara Whitmore was the one who spoke. Confirmed. The word fell into the room at the correct volume for a word that needed no amplification to carry. The 4 other family heads nodded in sequence, and approximately 30 people in that room exhaled at almost the same moment, a sound like a single long breath being released from a shared set of lungs, which was the sound of 60 people discovering simultaneously that the thing they had come to watch had not gone the way at least half of them had expected. Vess stepped forward immediately. He placed his own papers on the table, laid his pen beside them, and said, "Then we proceed to the second matter." Everett did not touch Vess's pen. He reached down and opened the leather case at his feet. He placed 3 things on the table in sequence, each one set down with the same care he had given the pitcher. First, the replacement consolidation document, folded into quarters, the creases worn along the lines where someone other than the author had refolded it many times with different intentions. Second, the old account ledger from his father's strongbox, cloth-bound, the spine soft with age. Third, a substantial stack of papers which he spread along the table in a single measured motion, one document at a time, until they covered the full length of the surface in front of the 5 seated figures. 47 documents, he said, cross-referenced against my father's handwritten records by the head of the Hollow Pine household, over the past 2 days. There are 6 additional volumes she has not yet opened. He placed his index finger on the folded replacement document. The Sutton household in Renelier borrowed $8,200, paid that debt down to $1,800, recorded by hand in my father's personal ledger. Then the borrower died. 11 days later, a new document arrived in the family's mailbox, described as a replacement consolidation instrument. The balance on that new document was $96,000. He picked it up and turned it, so the lower right corner was visible to everyone seated at the table. It does not carry the mark of this family. None of these 47 documents carries the mark of this family. Each one carries only a single handwritten signature. Every one of them was issued during the 14 months I was incapacitated and unable to review any correspondence. And the difference between what my family's records, as outstanding balances show, as outstanding balances, and what was collected through these instruments has never passed through a single account book belonging to this house. The room was so quiet that the oil burning in the nearest lampstand was audible. Vess stood at the edge of the table, and for 1 full second he produced nothing. Not a word, not a movement, not even the small social adjustments that people made when they were processing something unexpected. The pleasantness didn't fall from his face in the way that masks fell. It did something more specific and more telling than that. It went inward. The whole surface of his expression went briefly, precisely blank, the way a room went dark when the lamp was turned down rather than blown out, controlled even in its disappearance. And in the second that the blankness lasted, before the pleasantness was reconstructed and returned to its position, every person in that room who had been watching him saw it, including Mara at the far end, including Clara Whitmore, who had been watching men like Vess for 4 decades and knew exactly what that second of blankness meant. Then his voice came back, and it had climbed half a note above its usual register, and everyone in the room heard that half note, and there was no recovering from it. This requires review through proper channels, he said. The procedure for disputed instruments is established, and I would ask the council to follow it. Whitmore pulled one of the 47 documents toward herself and read it. She read for a long time. The room waited. When she set it down, she looked at the 4 people seated with her, and what moved between them in that look required no words to complete. 4 nods, one after another, in the unhurried sequence of people who had already reached a conclusion and were now confirming it. She looked at Vess. "You have no name," she said. Her voice was not loud. A room that quiet did not require volume to carry a sentence to its far end. "No house will conduct business with you. No table will seat you. No gathering of the 5 families will speak your name from this day." Vess stood in front of that sentence for 2 full seconds. His hands were at his sides. His face had returned to its usual pleasantness, but the pleasantness had lost its foundation. It was still there on the surface, still technically present, but it was sitting on nothing now, and the nothing underneath it was visible to anyone looking directly at him, which everyone in the room was doing. And then something happened that was small and exact, and more damning than any expression could have been. His right hand moved to the papers on the table, his own papers, the ones he had placed there for the second matter, the ones that would never now be addressed, and he gathered them with the same meticulous precision he brought to everything. Edges squared, stack neat. But his hands were working faster than his usual pace, and the speed was the only thing that broke, because a man who has spent 30 years making precision look effortless cannot entirely hide it when precision becomes effort. The papers were straight, but they were straight quickly, and quickly was something Roland Vess had never needed to be before in a room like this, and the room noticed. He picked the stack up. He walked the full length of the room toward the main door. 50 people, and he walked through the middle of them, and not one person moved to create space for him, and not one person held the door. It swung open under his own hand and it closed behind him, and the sound it made was entirely ordinary. The sound of a door, which was somehow the most absolute sound in the world. The room breathed. Everett stood at the head of the table with Vess's pen still lying exactly where it had been placed, and everything he held was still in his possession, and the room was in the particular state that followed the conclusion of something that had been a long time building. He did not pick up Vess's pen. He reached inside his coat and removed a second document, thinner than the 47, and placed it in front of Clara Whitmore.
Article 9, Section 4, he said.
In the assurance that Mr. Vess drafted 14 months ago, which I believe all 5 houses signed and sealed. Whitmore pulled it toward herself. The head of the family who completes the confirmation ceremony holds full authority for 72 hours, he continued. No council vote required. No approval from any of the 5 houses. Whatever he signs takes immediate effect and requires no review. He looked toward the far end of the table, where the other man's pen lay untouched. He wrote that provision so that a man who had just recovered authority could move quickly, reassure people, settle questions without waiting for committees. He looked once briefly toward the far end of the room, and it was the first time since he had entered that he allowed his eyes to go there. And Mara felt it from 40 feet away like a struck match, there, and then gone. A single deliberate look that said, "I know where you are," and then returned to the business at hand. He simply never considered what it permitted a man who read it from the other direction. Somewhere along the left wall, someone drew a breath that was audible. Everett opened the flat gray steel box. He removed the debt ledger, not the official account book, but the collection instrument registry, the actual physical record of 412 families and what each of them carried. He set it on the table. "I am dissolving the lending branch of this family's operations," he said. "All of it. 412 accounts permanently extinguished. Every original document destroyed. Every copy destroyed. No instrument of any kind remaining in any form." He opened the ledger to the first page and looked at it for a moment before he began. Sutton, Renelia, Cora. He read the name the way a man read the name of someone he knew. Not a notation, not an account reference. A person with a location and a name, and he gave it the weight it was owed. At the far end of the room, Mara's hand found the back of a wooden chair and gripped it. He read the second name and the third, and the room understood without being told that he intended to read every one of them, and the room did not interrupt him. He read with the same steadiness he brought to everything, unhurried, without emphasis, giving each name the weight of a person, rather than the weight of a line in a ledger. 15 names. 20. Clara Whitmore let him read 20 names, and then she said quietly, without the full authority she could have applied to the word, "That's enough." Everett closed the ledger. He signed the final page with his own pen, taken from his coat pocket rather than from the table. He set it down. "You understand what has occurred," he said. "This ledger was the collateral I pledged. It no longer exists. Under the provision exactly as written, authority returns to the council immediately. I won't contest it. I won't ask for time or extension." He looked at Whitmore. "I used 72 hours of full authority in approximately 4 minutes. Whitmore looked at him for a long time. The look of someone who had seen a great many things over a great many years and had arrived, through the accumulation of them, at the capacity to recognize something genuinely uncommon when it was standing in front of her. "You traded everything this family holds," she said, "for 412 names. No." His voice was quiet enough that the people at the far end of the walls leaned slightly forward, and that leaning told him he had found exactly the right volume for what he was about to say. "I traded it so that 412 people can go to bed at night without listening for a knock at the door. Keep the family name. It was never mine alone to begin with." People began to move. The configuration of the room shifted the way it shifted at the end of things. Weight changes along the walls. Hands unclasped, heads turning toward neighbors. Someone on the left side removed his hat and then replaced it without appearing to know why he had done either. The quality of the air in the room changed the way. Air changed when pressure finally broke and things were permitted to return to their natural motion. Everett walked the length of the room, toward the far end, toward where she was standing. And this time, he looked at her the way he had looked at her at the spring on the first afternoon, the complete and undeflected attention that had no architecture around it, and it traveled the length of the room while he was still 20 paces away and did not waver by a fraction. She did not wait for him to reach her. "You didn't look at me once," she said. Her voice broke on the third word cleanly, and she let it break because there was nothing to be gained from managing it, and because she was done managing things for the sake of other people's comfort. "From the moment you walked through that door until you closed the ledger." "Not once. Because if I had looked at you," he said, "you would have known, and I needed you standing at the back of this room without knowing anything. There were 60 people in this room this morning, and every single one of them had already listened to what they were going to see." He stopped in front of her. "I needed one person who hadn't decided yet." She shook her head. "Last night I sat on my porch and I made myself believe my mother's roof had never been part of a real promise. I made myself hold that thought all night, on purpose, because I needed to walk in here without trusting anyone." "I know." He said it without deflecting from it. "I told Amos to tell you the truth when you asked. I knew what you would think once you had it, and I needed you to think it. I needed you to walk in here with nothing, not my account of things, not Vess's, nothing except your own eyes." Mara looked at the face that had been weathered into its final form and had not intended to change further, and she thought about the porch in September when he had said he was afraid she would leave, said it to the pine trees rather than to her, as though the trees were a safer audience for the admission. And she thought about what it meant that she had been carrying that sentence for 23 days without knowing where to put it. He said it once. The way he said everything that mattered without preamble, without the protective structure that people built around true things to soften the landing for everyone involved. "I didn't keep that ledger to keep you." He looked at her directly. "I burned it because you were in it. Because a woman fell asleep in my spring, and when she woke up the first thing she did was tell me something true that 4 other people had been specifically employed not to notice. For 14 months I had been surrounded by people whose purpose was to protect me from accurate information. You walked in with no purpose at all and said the thing directly." He paused for exactly as long as the next sentence required. "I would rather be something broken that someone is willing to look at honestly than something preserved that no one is allowed to touch." Mara stood inside that sentence. She took the time to find all its dimensions before she responded. "You should have told me the ground was narrow," she said. "I know. You should have let me decide with full information. I know that too." He did not qualify it or repackage it into something smaller. "I was afraid and I chose what I chose, and both of those things are true at the same time, and neither of them makes the other less true." She looked at him. "That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 3 years," she said, "and I still haven't finished deciding what to do with it." "Take whatever time you need," he said, and at that precise moment, small enough that she would not have caught it from 2 steps farther away, his shoulder dropped. Not a collapse, a fraction. The specific fraction that came from a body that had been holding itself at formal attention for 2 hours and through something that required everything it had, and had just spent the last of what it had stored for the occasion. The right shoulder dipped a 1/4 inch and the arm shifted slightly outward, and she was there before she had made any conscious decision to move, both hands coming up under his arm from below. The grip she had developed through 23 mornings for exactly this configuration of this injury, and she held it. He didn't pull back. She kept both hands where they were, and she did not say anything clinical, did not instruct or explain. She looked at the collar of his wool coat and said, quietly, into the space between them, "I told you. That shoulder cannot carry everything alone." He placed his left hand over her hands, not grasping, simply placing the way you placed a hand on something to confirm it was real and present. And neither of them moved for a long moment in the gradually returning sound of a room resuming its ordinary life around them. Hetty Brand walked past them on her way toward the door, the father's parallel ledger under her arm, moving at her usual pace, which had never in her 71 years included dawdling. She did not slow down, and she did not look at them, and she gave no outward indication that she had registered anything at all. But as she passed, she said it, pitched only for the two of them, in the tone of a woman who had waited a considerable amount of time to say something, and was finally getting the opportunity about time, and kept walking. 3 weeks later, Everett rode to Renely alone. He left before Amos was up and took no horse from the main barn, but the one he kept in the smaller paddock for his own use. And he rode south on a November morning with the first real cold of the season in the air and the valley grass gone the color of old straw. He arrived at the Sutton yard fence at mid-morning and tied the horse and walked up the porch steps and knocked. Cora Sutton opened the door. She was wearing her dark wool dress and had her hair up and her cane in her right hand, and she looked at him the way a woman looked at someone she had been told about for 23 days without having seen, which was a different kind of looking than any description prepared you for. She did not speak immediately. She simply looked at him, and he was large enough in her doorway that the difference between what she had imagined and what was standing in front of her was briefly, plainly visible in her expression before she composed it. He removed his hat. He held out the document, the replacement consolidation instrument, with Vess's signature in the corner, where the Cane family mark should have been, plus this second page in his own hand voiding it by formal reference to the council's determination, and a third line below his signature in plain language. The Sutton account is extinguished. No balance remains. No successor instrument exists or will be issued. Cora took it. She read it through once in the morning light of the doorway. Then she read it again, her lips barely moving over certain phrases, in the specific way she read anything with a signature at the bottom. Then she looked up at him, and she was quiet for a moment, with the look of a woman who had arrived at 58 years, without learning to pretend she wasn't thinking what she was thinking, which meant what showed on her face was what was actually there. "Thank you for coming yourself," she said. He nodded. She did not fold the paper. She stepped back from the door. "There's coffee on the stove," she said. "If you have a few minutes." He had a few minutes. He came through the door with the slight forward inclination of his head that he made in low doorways without thinking about it, and Cora noted it without comment, and she led him to the kitchen and poured 2 cups, and they sat across from each other, at the table where Mara had sat many times over the past month and told her mother things that were difficult to say. They did not discuss the document, because the document had said what it needed to say, and there was no useful addition to make to it. They talked about the condition of the North Valley Road, which had washed badly in the October rains. They talked about whether the winter was likely to come early based on how the aspens had turned. They talked about the small, specific, durable things that constituted the texture of living in a particular place over time, and Everett turned out to be a man who could talk about those things with a directness that gave the conversation the quality of something substantial rather than something simply filling the space between silences. Cora noticed this. She stored it away in the manner she stored most observations, not immediately, but in layers, returning to it in the hours after while she was doing other things. When he stood to leave, she walked him as far as the kitchen door. He put his hat back on in the yard. He untied the horse and mounted with the ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times and had never found it worth thinking about. He turned south. Cora stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him go until the bend in the road took him from view. She thought about what Mara had said the morning after Denver, that the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 3 years had come from a man who had also been less than entirely honest with her, and that both of those things were true at the same time, and that she did not yet know what to do with the combination. Cora had thought about that sentence in the weeks since. She thought she was beginning to understand it. She went back inside. She set her coffee cup in the basin. She took the document from the pocket of her apron, where she had put it when she stepped back from the door, and she looked at it one more time. The final line in plain language, the signature, the absence of anything that needed to be carried anymore, and she folded it once, only once, and put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept the household accounts. Not the tin box, the regular drawer, because it was not a thing that needed to be hidden or protected or revisited in the small hours. It was simply a fact now, like the deed to the land, and it belonged with the other facts. She put the tin box itself on the kitchen table and opened it. Inside was the original instrument, Vess's document, the replacement consolidation instrument that had arrived in the mailbox 11 days after her husband died. She took it out and looked at it for a moment. The signature in the lower right corner. The number that had replaced her husband's faithful accounting. She folded it along its old creases, the ones worn smooth by years of her own hands finding the same lines in the dark when she needed to remind herself of what the number actually was. She carried it to the iron stove and opened the door and put it in and watched it catch. It was ash in under a minute. She closed the stove door. She stood in her kitchen in the November morning, with the coffee going cold on the counter and the sound of the fire settling inside the iron walls of the stove, and she felt the absence of the number, the way you felt the absence of a stone you had been carrying in your boot. For so long you had stopped noticing it was there. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than relief. The simple, durable fact of a weight no longer present. She washed the cups and went on with the morning. Mara stayed at the medical college through the winter. She had written to the registrar in October, and the registrar had written back that her record made resumption straightforward. She made arrangements for a neighbor to look in on Cora 3 times weekly, and Cora accepted these arrangements with the serene calm of a woman who had already made her own parallel arrangements and saw no particular reason to mention them, and who was walking better that fall than she had the previous 2 winters and had well-established opinions about not being organized on her behalf. Hollow Pine sent a rider south with correspondence once a week. This was Everett's arrangement, not formally stated but made evident through the regularity and through the fact that Amos was the one who brought it, which ruled out coincidence. The correspondence was practical in its character, the state of the North Road, the progress of the council's administrative proceedings following the Ledger dissolution, the condition of the winter pastures, the small operational facts of a large property moving through its season. But it arrived once a week without interruption, and Mara read every line of it and wrote back, and the writing back was practical in its character also, and what the practicality contained was something that did not require naming to be present between 2 people who were both paying attention. The sessions had done what sessions did. The shoulder had moved from defended to functional to something that, by December, a competent physician might have examined and found unremarkable. Not perfect bodies that had been through what his had been through, did not return to perfect, and she would not have trusted anyone who told her otherwise. But functional in the full sense of the word, a shoulder that did its work, that could be trusted with weight, that had stopped organizing the entire right side of the body around the project of protecting it. The tremor in the hand was gone, had been gone since the 16th day, which was before Denver, which meant that whatever happened in that room had happened to a hand that had already been repaired. She thought about that sometimes in the evenings in Cheyenne, in the small room she rented near the college. She thought about the fact that the work had been completed before the ceremony, which meant the ceremony had not been about the shoulder at all, or not only about the shoulder, which meant that the 30 days had been 2 things at once, as most important things were, and that the thing it had been beside the healing of the shoulder was something she was still in the process of naming. She thought about pain and fear, and the difference between them, which she now taught to the students in her practicum group when they were learning physical assessment. She had found that the distinction was more widely applicable than she had understood when she first articulated it beside a hot spring in September. Most people who came to a physician were afraid of something, and most of them had arranged that fear inside the body in a way that looked like a different problem than it was. Learning to read the arrangement was the work. The work never stopped being the work, no matter how many years you did it. She was back in Renelier for Christmas, and the valley was under a clean foot of snow that had come in from the north the week before and settled without wind into a surface that caught the low winter light and held it. Her mother was well. The kitchen was the same kitchen. The drawer where the household accounts were kept had one additional document in it now, folded once, which Cora had shown her the first evening she was home. Placing it on the table between them without ceremony, the way you placed something that belonged to the ordinary record of a life rather than to the territory of crisis. On the 2nd day of the new year, which came in cold and clear, with the kind of sky that Wyoming produced in January when the storms had moved through and left everything scoured and precise, Mara rode north. She came through the Hollow Pine Gate in the early afternoon, and Amos opened it without asking any questions, which remained his method, and she rode down to the hot spring on the path through the lodgepole pines and came out onto the rock shelf and found it empty, which she had not entirely expected. and she sat on the granite edge and put her feet in the water and waited. He came down the path 10 minutes later, barefoot, as he always was on this path. The formal coat was gone. He was in his flannel shirt and canvas work pants, the cold not appearing to trouble him in the way it troubled people of ordinary dimensions. He stopped when he reached the shelf and looked at her sitting there, and something moved across his face that was not a shadow this time and was not ambiguous. He sat on the edge a short distance from her and put his own feet in the water, and they were quiet for a while, in the way of people who had said difficult true things to each other, and were now on the other side of the difficulty, where the quiet had a different texture. "How is it?" he said. "The classes." She thought about it honestly before answering, which was the only way she answered things now. "Better than I expected in some ways and harder in others. The hard parts are the ones that require knowing things you can only learn through time." "What are the better parts?" "Reading what a body is doing when the person wearing it doesn't know. I'm more accurate now than I was when I left." He looked at the water. "What changed?" She was quiet for a moment. "Understanding," she said, "that what looks like a physical problem is sometimes a question the body is asking about whether it's safe to let something go, and that the answer to that question isn't something you can press in with your thumbs. It has to be earned." He turned his head and looked at her sideways, which was the closest thing to amusement she had seen from him. That wasn't the dry, compressed sound he had produced on the morning the water hadn't spilled. She put her hands on his shoulder. Not as a session. Not with clinical intention. She placed them the way she had placed them every morning for 23 days, and she felt what was there. The cable of muscle along the right side of his neck had become something more like its original architecture, present, functional, no longer doing 3 jobs at once. The zone below the shoulder blade had volume to it, the volume of tissue being used. There was still some of the old compensation pattern in how he carried the right arm, and there always would be, because bodies did not entirely forget what they had learned under duress. But forgetting entirely was not what healing required. Healing required learning to live in the full territory of an injury without being governed by it, which was different from pretending the injury had not occurred, and which was, she had come to understand, the harder and more honest of the 2 available positions. She took her hands back. "You should have the arm properly assessed by a physician in Cheyenne," she said. "I can give you a name." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll think about it." "That means no." "It means I'll think about it." She looked at him. He looked at her. And the look that passed between them had been building for 23 days, and had not fully resolved in the Denver room, and had not resolved in the weeks of letters after, and it was not going to resolve in a single moment at the edge of a hot spring in January either, because it was not the kind of thing that resolved in moments. It was the kind that resolved the way injuries resolved slowly, through the accumulation of small, honest adjustments over time, through the gradual recognition that what you had been bracing against had become, without your noticing the exact moment of change, simply part of what was true. "I'm not finished being angry about the night on the porch," she said. "I know. I may not be finished for some time." "All right." She looked at the steam rising off the water. "I'm also not finished with what I started here. The 2 things are both true." She said it in the same register she used for things that were accurate and did not require apology. So, he said. The water steamed between them, and the lodgepole pines moved very slightly in the cold air coming down off the ridge, and the light on the surface of the spring was the light on the surface of the spring, which was indifferent to everything and precisely and entirely itself. The following spring, in the small house on the eastern edge of the valley, where the big horn was still loud with snowmelt in April, and the first pale green was appearing on the south-facing slopes, Mara sat at the kitchen table in the early light, with both hands around a coffee cup, and the particular quality of tiredness that came not from deprivation, but from change the body, adjusting to a new set of facts about itself, which took time and which could not be hurried. Everett sat across the table. His right hand was resting on the wood between them, palm down, steady. She reached out and covered it with both of hers, and felt the pulse beneath her fingers, unhurried and even. And outside the window, the valley was doing what valleys did in April in Wyoming, which was turning back to green in the unhurried, absolute way of something that had always known it would. Some people spend their whole lives being treated as something precious, guarded, maintained at a careful distance from anything that might disturb them, while the question of whether they are in pain goes entirely unasked. And some people spend their whole lives as a number on the final line of a document, invisible except as a balance, unnamed except as an account, until someone decides that the number is not the point, that the point is the name above it, and that reading the name aloud in a room full of people who came to watch the arithmetic is the only act that cannot be undone by any instrument any man with a precise handwriting has ever drafted. What Everett Cane gave away in Denver was not a family. It was the permission to look at human beings as columns in a ledger and feel nothing about the total. What Mara Sutton gave him was not a hand that stopped trembling. It was the first honest accounting of what was actually broken, and it turned out that was the one thing, above all the things available to a man of his position, that no one had been willing to provide, and the one thing he had needed more than any other. No one is so poor that they have nothing true to offer, and no one is so powerful that they do not, in the end, need someone willing to tell them what is actually wrong.